Imagine the quiet glow of lanterns swaying softly in the cool night air, their light spilling gently onto cobblestone streets, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The evening mist curls like silk ribbons around the timbered beams of houses, drifting slowly through narrow lanes where the sound of the world softens to a hush. From somewhere beyond the clustered rooftops, the faint trickle of a river moves lazily under a stone bridge, its waters carrying away the day's noise, leaving behind only the stillness of twilight. A hearth crackles in the distance, its orange glow seeping through cracks in shutters, while the faint scent of wood smoke mingles with the earthy fragrance of damp straw, freshly trodden soil, and the iron tang of a smithy long since cooled. This is the world we enter tonight, the quiet, hidden life of the medieval blacksmith apprentice. Their days were not written into chronicles of kings or immortalized in tales of war, but instead carved themselves into the softer pages of everyday existence. Their rhythm was one of patience, steady repetition, and the quiet companionship of routine. Apprenticeship was not a story of drama, but of small rituals, unhurried tasks, and the long, slow shaping of both iron and self. Step with me into this slower current of time. Let us leave behind the rushing hours of the present and drift into an age where days stretched long, measured not by clocks but by bells, by the rise and fall of light, and by the hiss of hot iron meeting water. Imagine walking through the narrow lane toward a blacksmith's workshop as dawn begins to stir. The mist clings low, and your boots tap softly against cobblestones, slick with dew. The town is not yet fully awake. Only the baker's ovens stir, sending the sweet scent of bread into the cold air. A dog barks distantly, a rooster calls, and smoke curls lazily from chimneys, signaling the beginning of another day. Inside the workshop, the apprentices are already stirring. Their beds are simple straw mattresses laid against rough wooden walls. The rooms are cool, their air carrying the faint chill of stone. But the young workers rise with steady rhythm. Tunics are pulled over tired shoulders, belts fastened, boots laced. A basin of cold water waits, drawn from the well the evening before, and faces are splashed awake with brisk handfuls. Their breakfast will not be rich perhaps, a crust of coarse bread, dipped in watered ale or warm pottage, if fortune allows, but it carries them into the day, warming their bodies with a sense of constancy. The forge itself lies waiting. Before any sparks leap to life, the workshop is hushed, its tools resting in stillness. Hammers lie across benches, tongs hang on their hooks, and the anvil, silent now, seems like a slumbering giant. The apprentices know this space intimately. Even before their hands are trusted with great tasks, they sweep the floor, brush ash into corners, and lay fresh charcoal in place of yesterday's cinders. They stack kindling in neat piles and set bellows ready at hand. To prepare the forge is to awaken a companion, for fire itself is as much a partner in the craft as hammer or iron. When the first sparks are coaxed into flame, a transformation occurs. What was once dim and still becomes alive with light and sound. Shadows shift against the beams of the workshop. Warm air pushes back the chill, and the crackle of fire joins the sigh of bellows. Apprentices stand close, their eyes wide, watching. The flames lick upward as if greeting them once again. It is a ritual both ordinary and sacred. The daily rebirth of the forge. Life as an apprentice was not grand. The days held no sweeping victories, no sudden revelations. Instead, life unfolded in patient layers, carrying water from the well, chopping wood, sorting scrap iron, and laying tools in their proper place. Each of these tasks, though simple, carried weight. In the small actions, apprentices learned respect for their master, for their tools, and for the slow process of growth. Dust rose in beams of sunlight, motes drifting like tiny sparks in the air. Even the act of sweeping, repeated day after day, became a kind of quiet meditation. At times, apprentices did nothing more than watch. They stood silently at the edge of the workshop, eyes fixed on the master blacksmith as he worked. The sound of the hammer rose and fell, steady as a heartbeat, striking glowing iron until it bent, stretched, or curved into shape. Sparks leaped, in bursts of orange and white, falling like fleeting stars before vanishing on the floor. The air smelled sharp and metallic, tinged with smoke and sweat. For hours, the apprentices might stand without a word, absorbing the rhythm, the timing, the dance between fire, hammer, and hand. Only after long months of observation would they step forward to try their hand at the anvil. Their early work was humble, shaping a nail, flattening a hook, smoothing the edge of a hinge. Small pieces, unremarkable, yet each one a lesson in patience. Mistakes were frequent, corrections inevitable, but within these struggles lay the quiet pride of progress. To form something lasting from raw iron, even something as simple as a nail, was to feel the steady dignity of the trade. Outside the forge, life moved with the seasons. In winter, the warmth of the fire was a comfort against frost that clung to every doorway. In summer, the heat was almost unbearable, yet the rhythm continued without pause. Spring brought muddy boots, dripping eaves, and the scent of thawing earth. Autumn filled the air with smoke from harvest fires and the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. Apprentices moved through these cycles as naturally as they breathed, their lives woven into the slow fabric of time. Evening came with the cooling of the forge. Ash was swept once more, tools returned to their places, and the fire allowed to fade into embers. The apprentices, weary yet content, left the workshop behind. Some found quiet moments by the river, watching the ripples catch moonlight. Others returned to their quarters, mending clothing, sharing hushed talk, or simply lying back upon straw beds, letting muscles relax after long hours of labor. The town itself grew still. Lanterns flickered faintly in the streets, dogs barked in the distance, and shutters closed one by one. In these moments, apprentices carried with them not grand ambitions, but quiet dreams of tomorrow's work, of hammers striking true, of fire glowing steadily. Their lives were small in the eyes of history, yet filled with a calm dignity that endured far beyond their years. For each task, each breath, each moment spent by the forge was part of something greater, the shaping not only of iron, but of themselves. And so, as we drift into their world, we are invited to do the same, to slow our pace, to find comfort in repetition, and to let the quiet resilience of the past ease us into rest. Tonight, as the lanterns fade and the river carries the day away, let your body grow still, your breathing steady, and your thoughts soften like embers in the dark. In the hidden lives of blacksmith apprentices, you may find a gentle rhythm, a calm companion, and a doorway into sleep. The first light of dawn touched the medieval town with a softness that felt almost like silence. It did not burst across the rooftops all at once, but crept slowly, gently, as though the world itself was waking from a long night's rest. The sky turned from black to deep gray, and then into a faint wash of pale blue. High above the pointed gables of timber-bird houses, a thin mist drifted lazily, curling in the morning air. In the stillness of that hour, before the ringing of church bells, before the bustling of markets or the clatter of carts, a quieter world existed. It was the hour of apprentices, the young boys who lived behind or above the workshops of their masters. Their lives, though rarely written about, were shaped by these hushed beginnings. The apprentices' quarters were not grand. They were rooms built of timber and stone, practical and plain, pressed close to the forge itself. At night they absorbed the coolness of the walls, and in the morning they carried the faint smell of smoke, iron dust, and straw. Inside, the air was heavy but not unpleasant, the kind of air that clung to fabric and hair, marking its occupants as children of the forge. Straw mattresses rustled as the boys stirred awake. These beds were not soft, but they offered enough rest after the long hours of the day before. The straw was changed only when it became too damp or infested, and its faint grassy smell mixed with the rough scent of wool blankets. Each boy had little more than a blanket and a pillow stuffed with rags, but it was enough. The shutters creaked as one was pushed open, letting in a sliver of cold air. Light trickled through, catching dust that hung suspended in the room. The chill of stone walls lingered, wrapping itself around bare feet as they touched the floor. Some boys rose slowly, rubbing their eyes, stretching stiff muscles. Others sat still for a while, gathering strength for the day. The mornings were not rushed. The world of an apprentice began quietly, without fanfare, with the slow gathering of movement. Clothing was simple and unchanging. They dressed in coarse, wool tunics, thick enough to bear the chill but rough against the skin. Most tunics were brown or gray, the muted colors of undyed wool. Belts of leather were tied around the waist, and boots, often worn thin, were laced tightly. Each boy had only a few garments, patched and mended when torn. They carried no finery, no decoration, only what was needed for work. Beside each bed might rest a small wooden chest, or sometimes just a peg in the wall. In these small spaces, Apprentices kept their few belongings, a spare shirt, perhaps, a small knife, useful for cutting food or shaping wood, sometimes a token from home, a carved bead, a piece of ribbon, or a smooth stone carried for luck. These tiny objects held weight, for they reminded the apprentices of families they might not see for many years. A wooden bucket stood near the door, filled the night before from the town's well. Its water was cool, even biting. As the boys splashed it across their faces, it woke them sharply, chasing away sleep. Some lingered, staring into the ripples, as if the still water offered a moment of quiet reflection. Others hurried through the task, eager to move on. Towels were scarce. A sleeve or rough cloth served well enough. The first meal of the day was small. Bread, coarse and dark, often served with watered ale. On some mornings there was porridge, made from oats or barley, or a ladle of pottage left from the evening before. Cheese, if it was present, was a rare gift, its sharp taste cutting through the blandness of grain. They ate, seated on benches, or sometimes simply standing, their movements quiet. The sound of chewing, the scrape of wooden spoons, and the faint crackle of a dying hearth filled the room. Words were few. The apprentices did not waste energy on chatter. Morning was a time for steady gathering, not noise. Outside the quarters, the town began to stir. The cry of a rooster broke through the stillness. A dog barked in the distance. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling into the pale sky. The bakers' ovens released their fragrant steam, filling the air with the warm smell of bread. The sound of a church bell carried faintly, marking the early hour. Yet within the apprentices' quarters, there was still a sense of quiet separation, as if the world beyond the walls had not yet fully arrived. When the meal was done, the boys gathered. Their things, some carried small tools, though most left their chests behind. They did not yet need the heavier instruments of the forge. Their work would begin with sweeping, fetching, and arranging. They knew this, and they accepted it. Apprenticeship was not about glory, but about repetition, patience, and slow progress. The walk to the workshop was short, yet meaningful. Each step was a shift from the private world of sleep to the shared world of labor. Shoes clattered on stone, boots brushed straw scattered across the ground. The boys moved in a line, quiet but steady, toward the waiting doors of the forge. The workshop stood silent, its tools resting where they had been left the night before. The anvil sat heavy, unmoving, like a giant asleep. Hammers lay across benches, their handles darkened from years of use. Tongs hung on hooks, their shapes outlined against the dim light. The forge itself was cold, its ashes grey, holding only the memory of yesterday's fire. The air smelled faintly of soot and iron, a scent that clung to the walls like a memory that never faded. Before the fire was kindled, before any sparks leapt to life, the apprentices stepped into this quiet. They did not rush to disturb it. They understood, even in their youth, that a workshop was not just a place of noise and labor. It was a space that demanded respect. To sweep the floor, to gather charcoal, to set the bellows in order. These were not small tasks, but acts of care. They were the first duties of the day, the quiet preparation that would allow the forge to live again. As they moved through these motions, there was a calmness in their rhythm. The scrape of brooms across stone, the soft thud of wood stacked against the wall, the shuffle of feet carrying buckets of water from the well. Each sound was small, but together they created a kind of music, gentle, steady, unhurried. Life in the apprentices' quarters was not easy, but it was steady. It gave them order, a pattern to follow. In that pattern, they found security. They might be far from home, their families distant, but here they belonged to a rhythm greater than themselves. They were part of the forge, part of the household, part of the town. The seasons marked their mornings in subtle ways. In winter, the air in the quarters was biting, their breath visible in faint clouds. They rose reluctantly, clutching blankets for warmth, their fingers numb as they splashed icy water on their faces. In summer, the heat came early, seeping through shutters before dawn, making sleep restless. Spring brought dampness, the smell of thawing earth and dripping roofs. Autumn carried a crispness, the crunch of straw underfoot, and the knowledge of shorter days ahead. Each season wove itself into the texture of their lives, shaping their mornings as surely as the ringing of bells. Emotion lived quietly in these spaces. Apprentices carried hope, though it was a quiet kind, hope for progress, for skill, for the approval of their master. They carried fear toother, fear of mistakes, of harsh words, of failure, but above all, they carried patience. They knew their path would be long, measured in years rather than days. Each morning was not a beginning and an end, but a small step in a long journey. As the sun lifted higher, golden light began to spill across rooftops, reaching the windows of the quarters. The town awoke fully then, the sounds of carts on cobblestones, voices calling across streets, animals stirring in pens. But for the apprentices, the day had already begun. Their rhythm was set. Their bodies were moving. The forge awaited. And so, the apprentices stepped from the quiet of their quarters into the wider world of the workshop. Their lives, though ordinary, carried a certain dignity, for in their simple mornings, waking on straw, washing in cold water, eating plain bread was the foundation of a craft that would endure for centuries. In these beginnings, we find something timeless: the quiet stir of dawn, the slow shuffle of feet, the soft breath before work begins. These moments remind us that history is not always made in great halls or on battlefields, but in small rooms where boys rose from straw beds, tied belts around their waists, and walked steadily toward the waiting forge. The day had not yet truly started, and yet, in these first hours, the shape of life was already present, quiet, patient, and enduring. The day had already begun, long before the forge itself came alive. In the stillness of the early morning, when the first pale rays of light touched the wooden beams of the workshop, the apprentices moved with slow and steady gestures. They had already risen from their straw beds, shaken off the remnants of sleep, and eaten their modest meal. Now, they turned their attention to the heart of their learning, the blacksmith's workshop, a place that felt both ordinary and sacred at once. The air still carried the damp chill of night. The stone walls of the building were cool to the touch, and the scent of earth clung faintly to the wooden threshold. Apprentices pushed open the heavy doors, their hinges groaning softly, as though the building itself were stretching awake after slumber. The sound was familiar, never startling, part of the daily rhythm that marked the beginning of work. Inside, the workshop lay quiet, waiting, filled with shadows that thinned as the light slowly crept in. A thin beam of sunlight fell through a gap in the shutters, crossing the floor in a golden stripe, touching first the anvil, then the worn wooden bench where tools rested. Their first task was always to bring order. The forge, after a day's work, was left with scattered ash and half-burnt pieces of charcoal. Dust settled in corners, tools leaned against one another, and shavings of metal lay like forgotten crumbs across the benches. Apprentices moved with deliberate care, sweeping away the ash, gathering scraps, and stacking fresh charcoal into neat piles. The broom bristled against stone, the sound muted and rhythmic, almost like a whisper. Each motion was unhurried, purposeful, never rushed. There was a lesson hidden in these small rituals. A blacksmith's art did not begin in the blaze of fire, or the clang of hammer against iron, but in the quiet moments of preparation. Apprentices learned that order brought calm, and calm prepared the mind for precision. Just as one tended to a hearth at home, so too must the forge be tended with respect. It was not simply a tool, it was the living heart of the workshop. The crackle of fire, once lit, would become the rhythm of the day, and so the space around, it had to be worthy of its glow. The scent of the workshop was unmistakable, a blend of soot, resin, damp wood, and iron. It clung to clothes, skin, and hair, so that even beyond the doors an apprentice could be recognized by it. Yet within these walls, that scent was not unpleasant. It was grounding, familiar, like the aroma of bread in a baker's home or the tang of hay in a stable. The apprentices inhaled it as they worked, as though the very air itself whispered reminders of what they were becoming. Sunlight grew stronger, sliding through narrow slits and high windows, falling across the forge and the tools. The hammer heads gleamed faintly, dulled with use, their handles worn smooth by countless hands. Tongs, chisels, and files lay in orderly rows once the apprentices had placed them carefully. Each had its place, and each was treated with the same respect, as a craftsman might offer a prayer, for tools were companions in this life of work, carrying the weight of both failure and success, teaching patience through their demands. As the sweeping slowed and the benches cleared, the apprentices prepared the fuel. Charcoal was stacked, in careful shapes, logs chosen for their dryness, kindling gathered from the bundles kept in storage. There was no rush to spark the fire. Instead, there was a calm, almost ceremonial rhythm. as though the lighting of the forge marked not just the start of a day, but a kind of awakening shared by both man and place. One apprentice might pause to run a hand across the anvil's flat surface, feeling the cool hardness that would soon ring with sound. Another might adjust a bucket of water kept for tempering, ensuring it was full and clean. The smallest details mattered each step, part of an unseen pattern, like beads strung on a cord, simple yet significant. It was in these moments that apprentices learned to see not just with their eyes, but with attention. Nothing was wasted, nothing was dismissed. The silence of the workshop was not empty. It carried the faint sounds of the world outside, a rooster, crowing footsteps on cobblestones, the distant toll of a church bell. These sounds seeped gently through the wooden doors, reminders that the town itself was waking. Yet within the workshop, the silence remained steady, as though the space existed, slightly apart from the rest of the world. Apprentices moved quietly, their tasks absorbing them, their breaths forming soft clouds in the cool air. Emotion threaded through these routines, though rarely spoken aloud. For the young apprentices, the workshop was a place of both weight and promise. It was the ground where they were tested daily, not in grand trials, but in the persistence of effort. They felt both the burden of expectation and the quiet pride of belonging to something greater than themselves. Each sweep of ash, each tool set in order, became part of a story that stretched beyond their years, of smiths who had worked before them, and of those yet to come. As the last traces of ash were cleared and the forge prepared for lighting, the apprentices paused. Their hands, smudged with soot, rested briefly on knees or benches. There was a moment of stillness, almost like a held breath, before the first spark would be struck. This pause was not commanded by the master. It was simply felt, as though the space itself asked for recognition. To light the forge was to wake, a companion who would burn and roar for hours, demanding care, shaping the day. The spark came from flint and steel, small, fleeting, caught carefully in kindling until smoke curled upward. Soon, flames licked at the charcoal, orange tongues growing stronger, crackling softly as if speaking their own language. Apprentices leaned close, feeding the fire, coaxing it with patience. The warmth spread slowly, filling the room, driving away the damp chill. Shadows shifted on the walls, growing softer under the flickering light. The forge was alive once more, and with it, the day truly began. From here, the rhythm would quicken. The master's voice would call, hammers would rise, and sparks would fly. But in this early hour, before the work became loud and consuming, there lingered a sense of peace. The doors had been opened, the space prepared, the forge awakened, and in those rituals, the apprentices carried not only tools, but lessons. That patience mattered, that care shaped craft, and that beginnings were as sacred as endings. The workshop stood, as it always had, a place of smoke and fire, of labor and learning. Yet for those who moved quietly in the morning hours, opening its doors and tending its hearth, it was also a place of stillness. Here, in the soft glow of a growing fire, the apprentices found a rhythm that connected them to something timeless. The forge would roar, the hammers would ring, but it was in these moments of preparation, in the gentle act of opening the workshop doors, that the day's true foundation was laid. The embers grew stronger, and the apprentices, now warmed by both fire and routine, stood ready. What lay ahead would demand effort and resilience, yet it was anchored in the calm beginnings they had created. Outside, the town bustled to life, but within these walls, the heart of the day was already beating, steady and sure. The forge had been awakened, and with it, the apprentices stepped fully into their world. The forge could not live on fire alone. For all its brilliance, its sparks, and its heat, the forge depended on quieter companions, fuel and water. Without wood and charcoal to feed its flames, and without cool water to temper the metal, the blacksmith's craft would falter. The apprentices, still in the early years of their learning, discovered that their work often began not at the anvil, but on the paths of the village, carrying buckets, bundles, and armloads of fuel. These errands were not glorious. They lacked the bright drama of sparks flying beneath a hammer, and they carried none of the pride of finishing a sharpened blade or a set of sturdy hinges. Yet in these seemingly small tasks, the rhythm of apprenticeship unfolded. The gathering of fuel and water was steady, unchanging, and entirely necessary. To tend a forge was to tend life itself, and life could not be sustained without such careful routines. At dawn, before the forge had grown into its full voice, apprentices lifted wooden buckets with worn handles. They rested them against their hips, adjusted ropes, and stepped out into the cool air. The morning mist still lingered, curling over gardens and drifting across the narrow dirt roads of the village. Their footsteps sounded softly on the earth, a muted crunch, as they made their way toward the well or, at times, a nearby stream that wound lazily through meadows. The path was familiar, repeated countless times, yet never quite the same. Some mornings smelled of wet grass, others of wood smoke drifting from cottage chimneys. The well stood at the heart of the village, its stone rim smoothed by many hands. Generations of villagers had leaned over its edge, lowered buckets, and drawn water from its depths. The stone was cool beneath the apprentices' fingers, damp from the constant touch of ropes and splashes. The wooden pulley creaked with every turn, a sound as steady and predictable as the tolling of the church bell. Apprentices watched as the bucket descended into the shadowed water, the rope playing out in their palms, then waited for the hollow splash far below. The rope grew heavier as the bucket filled, droplets sliding down fibers, leaving dark trails. Hauling the full bucket upward was its own kind of lesson. Shoulders strained, arms tightened, and the wooden handle bit faintly into the skin of the hands. The slosh of water inside was a sound both comforting and frustrating, a reminder of the weight that must be carried back. When the bucket finally broke the surface and was drawn over the rim, cool beads scattered onto the stone, and the apprentices breathed deeply, savoring the crisp scent of fresh water. They poured it carefully into their waiting vessels, mindful not to spill what had been drawn with such effort. Sometimes, the journey to fetch water led not to the well but to a stream outside the village. This path wound past gardens where women bent over rows of herbs, their aprons brushing against thyme and sage. Children played at the edges, their laughter rising like birdsong in the morning air. Beyond, fields stretched outward, dotted with grazing animal scows, lowing softly, goats tugging at tufts of grass. The apprentices walked steadily, buckets swinging lightly when empty, heavy when full, nodding in quiet recognition to neighbors they passed. Each greeting was simple, a tilt of the head, a soft good morning, yet each one carried a thread of belonging. At the stream, water moved with patient constancy, trickling over stones smoothed by time. Apprentices crouched, dipping their buckets carefully, watching the ripples spread outward. The coolness seeped into their fingers as they steadied the vessels, knees pressed against damp earth, and the scent of wet soil clung to their clothes. Here, the air was different, fresher, scented with reeds and the faint musk of water plants. Birds darted low over the surface, their wings catching the morning light. With buckets filled, the apprentices rose slowly, balancing the weight, preparing for the return. Carrying water was never easy. The buckets grew heavier with each step, shoulders aching, arms straining. The sloshing rhythm of liquid against wood became part of the soundscape of the day. Sometimes apprentices adjusted their gait, leaning, slightly tilting the buckets just enough to steady the load. Drops fell along the path, darkening the dust or sinking into grass, leaving a faint trail behind. Yet even in the strain, there was a kind of steadiness. The body learned balance, the mind learned patience. Each journey was a reminder that strength was not built at once, but over countless repetitions. Fuel, too, demanded its share of labor. In a small storage shed, stacks of wood and bundles of charcoal waited, but those supplies had to be gathered and replenished. Apprentices fetched logs from nearby woodpiles or carried sacks of charcoal from traders who delivered them. Charcoal was black and dusty, staining hands and faces with smudges that no amount of wiping could fully erase. The apprentices accepted these marks as part of their trade, just as farmers accepted soil beneath their nails or shepherds carried the smell of wool. Logs were heavier still. Rough bark scraped against skin, splinters lodged in palms, and arms trembled under the strain of carrying more than seemed possible. Yet the task was never done in haste. Apprentices learned to pause, to set the load down, to breathe. They discovered that patience was not weakness, but wisdom, for rushing often led to wasted effort or injury. Each step back toward the workshop was measured, each burden carried with the knowledge that without it, the forge would fall silent. Neighbors often saw them laboring under these weights and offered quiet words. An old woman tending her chickens might nod approvingly, remembering when her own sons had once been apprentices. A farmer passing with his cart might offer a brief lift, saving them a stretch of the road. These small exchanges tied the apprentices not only to their master but to the fabric of the community itself. Their work fed not only the forge but the life of the village, providing nails for carpenters, tools for farmers, hinges for doors, and horseshoes for travelers. The errands of fetching water and gathering fuel were threads that bound the apprentices to the larger world around them. In carrying these burdens, they carried connection to the well dug by ancestors, to the stream flowing from hills, to the wood felled in distant groves, to the charcoal burned in quiet kilns. Each bucket, each log, was more than just material, was a piece of the village's life, flowing into the workshop, feeding the fire that in turn served the people. By the time the apprentices returned to the workshop, shoulders aching and hands darkened, the forge stood waiting. The logs would be stacked neatly by the wall, the charcoal stored in bins, the buckets of water placed near the quenching trough. The master might glance at their work, perhaps with a small nod, before turning back to his own tasks. There was no ceremony in these labors, no praise spoken loudly. Yet in the quiet acknowledgement of duty done, apprentices found a steady pride. The day could not continue without these small, essential acts. Fire needed feeding, and iron needed cooling. The forge was not sustained by grand gestures, but by the ordinary. Repeated rhythms of workhove, fuel lifted, water carried, burdens borne. And so, in gathering fuel and water, apprentices came to understand that strength was built not only in the hammer's strike but also in the steady weight of the bucket and the rough heft of the log. The errands might have seemed humble, but they carried within them the same lessons that shaped the smith's art: patience, balance, rhythm, and respect for what sustained life. As the apprentices leaned their weary backs against the cool stone walls of the workshop, resting before the next task, they could feel in their bodies the truth of these lessons. For the forge was more than fire, it was the union of earth, water, air, and human hands. And each morning's journey to gather fuel and water was a quiet reminder of that union, binding them to their craft, their community, and the steady passage of time. By mid-morning, when the village's streets were fully awake and the fields stirred with labor, the forge began to claim its own life. The apprentices, already weary from hauling buckets of water and stacks of fuel, gathered near the hearth. Their shoulders were stiff, their palms scraped, yet in their eyes lingered a quiet anticipation. For if the earlier errands tethered them to the rhythms of community, it was here at the forge's mouth that their craft took breath. The hearth itself seemed plain at first glance, a pit of stone, layered with ash from countless days past, its edges blackened by smoke that had climbed upward year after year. Yet to those who had watched its glow, it was more than stone and soot. It was a vessel of transformation, a place where cold, unyielding iron would soften, where human hands would command shape from stubborn matter. Every morning, the forge was reborn, and each rebirth began the same way, with the humble coaxing of sparks. The apprentices laid kindling with practiced care. Thin twigs gathered from hedgerows, curls of bark shaved from logs, bits of straw carried in from barns. These formed the nest in which the day's first fire would be born. They crouched low, arranging each piece as though setting bones for healing, for one wrong angle could smother breath before it began. Dust rose faintly as they worked, catching the angled shafts of sunlight that slipped through small cracks. In the workshop's roof, from a small pouch, the master drew a piece of flint and struck it against steel. The sound was sharp, a spark leaping outward, only to vanish into ash. Again he struck, again the brief flare of light. The apprentices leaned closer, shielding the kindling with cupped hands, until at last one spark caught. A faint glow pulsed at the edge of straw, then hesitated. The apprentices bent low, their breaths gentle, feeding the ember with patience. Slowly, the faint glow grew brighter, curling smoke rising into the still air. The fragile beginnings of flame trembling like a newborn's breath. At first, the fire was quiet. It whispered rather than roared, licking at straw, testing the bark. But with each careful breath, each added stick, it strengthened. Soon the twigs snapped crisply, their edges curling, blackened, consumed. Heat pressed upward, and the apprentices felt its warmth brush their cheeks. Shadows shifted along the workshop walls, and in the glow of the new flame, the day's true labor began. By the time the bellows were set in motion, the fire had already grown to a steady heart of coals. The apprentices gripped the wooden handles, pulling back, then pushing forward, over and over. The leather folds sighed open, then collapsed, exhaling a rush of air into the flame. With each breath of the bellows, the fire responded, flaring brighter, snapping louder, burning hotter. The rhythm soon filled the workshop, a steady push and pull, like lungs expanding and contracting. It was a music of its own, the hiss of air, the crackle of coal, the dull thump of bellows against wood. Apprenticeship, the master reminded them, was as much about listening as it was about doing. A smith who did not hear his fire was blind to its language. The forge spoke in tones and rhythms, in the sharp hiss of water when iron plunged deep, in the rising roar when air surged through the coals, in the faint crackle when damp wood had slipped mistakenly into the fire. To know the forge was to tune one's ear to these sounds, to let them guide the hands. The warmth grew, spreading outward from the hearth. It touched the anvils, warming their iron surfaces, and it reached into the bones of the apprentices, loosening stiff muscles. The workshop's shadows danced now, swaying in rhythm with the flame. Dust motes glittered in the light, turning the air itself into a shifting tapestry. The smell of smoke and resin clung to clothes, to hair, to skin. For those who worked here, there was no escaping it. They carried the forge wherever they went, its scent marking them as surely as any badge. The master stood near, silent yet commanding. His eyes, narrowed against the glare, studied the fire as one studies an old companion. He could read its hunger, its moods. He knew when to feed it charcoal, when to let it breathe, when to draw it hotter, and when to let it rest. The apprentices watched him, hoping to glean understanding, but he gave no lectures in those moments. The forge was the teacher, and its lessons came only to those willing to observe. The first iron of the day was laid upon the coals, a dull bar, cold and unremarkable. It seemed impossible that such a rigid piece could ever be coaxed into new form. Yet as it rested in the glowing heart of the fire, change began. The surface darkened, then brightened faintly. Soon faint shades of red shimmered along its length, deepening with every breath of the bellows. The apprentices leaned close, their faces glowing in reflected heat, watching the slow birth of color. Iron, lifeless minutes ago, now pulsed as though alive. The master motioned, and an apprentice seized the long tongs, lifting the bar from its bed of coals. It shimmered, glowing orange at its center, darker at its edges. The air hissed faintly. Around it, heat, radiating outward in waves. Carried to the anvil, it was laid flat, and the hammer fell. The sound rang out, a deep, resonant strike that filled the workshop. Sparks burst outward, brief stars against the dim air. The apprentices flinched instinctively, though their master did not so much as blink. The first hammer stroke of the day had been struck, and the forge had fully awakened. What followed was a pattern repeated countless times through centuries of craft. Iron returned to fire, grew hotter, brighter, more pliable. It returned to anvil, where hammer and hand reshaped it. Each cycle carried rhythm, balance, and patience. Apprentices learned not only with their eyes but with their ears, the change in tone as hammer met hotter iron, the subtle shift in hiss when metal was quenched in water. To an untrained ear it was chaos. To the smith it was music composed of fire, air, water, and stone. Hours passed in this way, though time seemed suspended. The apprentices measured the day not by the sun's angle outside, but by the rhythm of hammer, bellows, and flame. Sweat dampened their brows, trickled down their backs, mingling with soot and ash. Their hands grew black, their muscles weary, yet still they pressed on, learning with each motion the language of the forge. For the forge was not only a place of labor, it was also a place of meditation. The repetition of tasks, the pulling of bellows, the placing of iron, the steady hammer strokes lulled the apprentices into a state of focus deeper than thought. The world beyond the workshop walls receded. Fields, chatter, market stalls, even the voices of neighbors all fell away. Within the forge, there was only flame and rhythm, sound and heat. Apprentices who once found the work burdensome began to find it strangely calming. In the fire's roar and the bellow's breath, they discovered a silence within themselves. By midday, the forge roared at its full strength. Its light blazed across the workshop, shadows shrinking into corners. The apprentices had grown more confident, moving with surer steps, their motions no longer hesitant but flowing. They began to sense the balance between patience and urgency. To wait too long risked burning the iron, yet to rush too soon left it unformed. Timing, like listening, became a lesson etched into their muscles. The master spoke rarely, offering only brief instructions. A word here, a gesture there. He trusted the forge to teach. Mistakes were inevitable and left too long. Edges cooled unevenly, hammer blows that struck askew. Yet each error was corrected, not with scolding, but with repetition. Apprentices were sent to begin again, to place the iron once more upon the coals, to strike once more with the hammer. In this way, the forge itself became a stern yet patient guide. And so the day unfolded, not in drama, but in steady ritual. Fire-fed, iron-heated, hammer-struck, water hissed. The apprentices came to see that their trade was not a series of separate tasks, but a single continuous rhythm, a weaving together of elements. They began to sense how the forge mirrored life itself. Beginnings fragile as sparks, growth nurtured by breath, strength tested by heat, and balance achieved only through patience and care. When the first sparks had been coaxed that morning, the fire had seemed delicate, vulnerable. Yet now, by afternoon, it blazed with steady confidence, as though it had never been in doubt. The apprentices, too, felt changed. Their arms ached, their backs were sore, their skins smudged and reddened. Yet beneath the fatigue was a quiet pride. They had tended the fire, fed it, worked beside it. They had listened to its voice and learned to move within its rhythm. And when at last the master allowed them a brief rest, they stepped outside into the bright air, blinking against the sun. The village sounds returned to them, children calling, carts rolling, birds singing. Yet even then, in their ears lingered the steady roar of flame, the sigh of bellows, the ringing echo of hammer upon iron. The forge remained with them, its lessons carried not in words but in muscle, in rhythm, in memory. Thus the first sparks of the forge were never only about fire, they were about awakening of flame, of iron, of apprentices who slowly learned that their true craft was not merely to shape metal, but to be shaped by the forge itself. The life of an apprentice was rarely filled with the grand, dramatic scenes that later storytellers like to imagine. It was not a constant flurry of sparks flying or heroic feats of hammering iron into shape. Instead, much of it was quiet work that seemed simple on the surface, but carried meaning beneath. Before an apprentice ever learned to hold the hammer with confidence or draw a blade from the fire with pride, they first had to learn the patience of small duties. Sweeping the floor, sorting the scraps, and arranging the tools might not sound like the heart of a blacksmith's trade, but to the apprentice it was the true beginning of their education. The morning light slanted through narrow windows, carrying with it a haze of dust that hovered in the beams. Each particle, floating slowly in the air, seemed like a spark waiting for its purpose. Apprentices moved about the workshop quietly, broom handles creaking, the soft swish of bristles scraping across the stone floor. Dust and ash from yesterday's work still lingered, mixed with the fragments of charcoal that had fallen near the forge. Tiny curls of iron filings glimmered faintly when the light struck them, like stars caught in the cracks of the floor. To sweep was not just to clean, it was to notice. It was to take account of what had been left behind by the previous day's work, to honor the effort already poured into the workshop, and to prepare the ground for the labor yet to come. Every tool had its place, and every place taught a lesson. Along one wall, wooden pegs held hammers of many sizes. Some were heavy and broad, made for shaping thick bars of iron. Others were small, almost delicate, designed for detail and finishing work. The apprentice who reached for a tool without looking first had to learn the difference by weight, by feel, by the subtle balance of the handle in their hand. Sorting tools back into order was not simply a chore, it was a way of memorizing their purpose. Each day, apprentices ran their fingers along the wooden handles, noting the smoothness worn by years of grip, the chips and scars that told of long use. To know the tools was to know the trade, and even in silence the iron seemed to whisper its history. Scrap iron too had to be gathered and placed in neat piles. Odd-shaped fragments, bent nails, and broken links of chain were not thrown away. In a medieval smithy, nothing was wasted. Apprentices learned quickly that iron was too precious to discard. Even the smallest piece might one day be reforged, melted back into usefulness, or reshaped into a nail, a hook, or a clasp. Carrying these scraps, setting them into boxes or bins, The apprentices came to understand thrift, resourcefulness, and respect for material. Each piece, no matter how small, carried the weight of potential. As they swept and sorted, the workshop, filled with soft rhythms, the gentle drag of the broom across stone, the clink of iron on iron as scraps were gathered, the quiet shuffle of feet, these became a kind of music, the background hum of a craft preparing itself for greater work. The apprentices rarely spoke during these early tasks. Words were unnecessary. Instead, they listened to the language of order. They listened to the silence of the workshop, breathing before the roar of the forge began. There was a kind of humility in these duties. Apprenticeship was not a path for those who sought glory quickly. It was a slow surrender to patience. Each time the floor was swept, each tool placed back, each fragment of iron gathered, the apprentices were reminded that mastery was not born from great moments alone, but from countless small ones. The discipline of arranging, cleaning, and preparing was itself a foundation. Just as a building cannot stand without its stones being set in careful order, so too a blacksmith could not rise without first learning the order of their tools and their space. Sometimes, the master blacksmith would walk quietly among them, saying little but observing much. He would notice whether a broom missed the corners, whether tools were hung with care, whether scraps were tossed together or sorted thoughtfully. To him, these details spoke more loudly than words. A careless apprentice at the broom would one day be careless with the hammer. A thoughtful apprentice in sorting scraps would one day forge with precision. The workshop, then, was both school and test, and the simplest chores were the first lessons in character. The air itself carried reminders of work. The scent of soot lingered from the previous day, mingling with the faint tang of resin from wooden beams. In some corners, the faint metallic taste of iron seemed to settle on the tongue, as if the very air had absorbed the essence of the trade. To sweep, to sort, to organize, was also to breathe in the identity of the smithy, to let it settle into memory until it became second nature. For young apprentices, there was also an emotional rhythm in these duties. At first, sweeping felt tedious, sorting seemed beneath them, and handling scraps felt like a waste of energy. But over time, as their hands repeated the same motions, a strange comfort emerged. The regularity of it, the predictability, gave shape to their mornings. In a world that could often feel uncertain, where weather ruined crops or sickness swept through villages, the workshop offered order. Within its stone walls, the apprentices found a routine that anchored them, a small sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Even the dust carried meaning. In the soft beams of light, when particles floated lazily, apprentices sometimes paused, leaning on their brooms for a moment to watch. The tiny motes shimmered like sparks in slow motion, as though the forge itself had breathed out remnants of its fire. In those small moments, the apprentices felt both very small and very much a part of something endless. They were not just boys sweeping a floor. They were keepers of a tradition, caretakers of a space that linked them to generations before and after. And so, sweeping and sorting became a meditation. The body worked, but the mind drifted. Apprentices thought of their families at home, of the meals they would share in the evening, of the seasons changing beyond the workshop walls. They thought of the iron itself, of how something so hard could bend under fire, how something so heavy could be shaped into tools of grace and strength. These quiet thoughts wove into the rhythm of the broom and the clink of iron, forming a kind of inner education that no spoken lesson could teach. In time, the apprentices began to sense the hidden wisdom in these chores. They learned that a clean floor reduced accidents, that knowing where tools hung saved time and effort, that sorting scraps properly meant the forge never lacked material. What at first seemed dull became essential. The apprentices realized that the smallest tasks were not a distraction from the craft, but the very bones of it. A smithy in disorder could not function. A blacksmith who ignored details could not master the art, and so sweeping, sorting, and learning became inseparable from forging, hammering, and creating. By midday, the workshop usually shone with quiet readiness. The floors were cleared, tools gleamed in their places, and scraps were stacked neatly. The apprentices stood in the forge not only as cleaners, but as learners, their hands carrying the memory of order, their minds prepared for the greater labors that lay ahead. It was not dramatic work, not the kind of labor that filled stories or songs, but it was the steady heartbeat of the forge, the rhythm beneath the fire and sparks, the invisible preparation that made all else possible. And as the day moved forward, The apprentices carried with them the lessons of the broom and the brush, of the peg and the hammer, of the scrap pile and the careful order. These lessons were not spoken aloud, but they stayed etched into memory, waiting for the moment when each apprentice would one day stand at the forge as a master, quietly teaching the next generation the same truth. That great skill is built first in small acts of care. Apprenticeship was not only about what one did with their own hands, but also about what one allowed their eyes and ears to gather in silence. The forge was a place of noise and heat, yet within its chaos existed a strange and deliberate stillness. For the apprentices, one of their greatest privileges was not touching the tools at all, but simply standing nearby, observing the master as he worked. The lesson began not with hammer or tongs, not with bellows or fire, but with the quiet discipline of watching closely and learning to see beyond the surface of motion. The master blacksmith's day followed a rhythm shaped by years of habit. Long before apprentices ever thought to raise a hammer, the master was already attuned to the language of metal. To watch him was to see a conversation unfold in unspoken dialogue between man, fire, and iron. Apprentices lined the edges of the workshop, careful not to stand too close, for the air shimmered with heat and the floor scattered with sparks. They learned to be still, to breathe slowly, to let their eyes adjust to the glow of the forge and the sudden flares of light that danced with every strike. The master's hammer rose and fell in steady cadence, a rhythm that was neither hurried nor hesitant. Each blow seemed inevitable, as though the iron had already decided its shape and the hammer simply revealed what was waiting. Apprentices noted the grip, the angle, the way the master shifted his stance for heavy strikes and then softened for finer touches. Even the smallest detail, the tilt of his wrist, the pause between strikes, was a lesson written in movement. The sound filled the workshop, echoing off stone walls. Clang, hiss, clang, hiss. The hiss was the voice of water meeting fire, steam rising in a sharp whisper as the hot iron was quenched. Apprentices came to recognize this sound as surely as they recognized their own heartbeat. It was the rhythm of creation, the pulse of transformation. To listen to it day after day was to internalize its measure, until one could almost sense when the hammer would fall, even with closed eyes. Smell was another teacher. The scent of hot iron lingered, metallic and sharp, mingled with the smoky sweetness of burning coal. Apprentices learned to distinguish the stages of heat, not only by sight, but by scent. At first the metal gave off a faint dryness, like stone warming in the sun. As it glowed red, the air thickened with a pungent temps that seemed to stick to the throat at white heat. The scent was fierce and biting, a signal that the metal was malleable, but also dangerously fragile. Watching the master meant inhaling these lessons, letting them etch themselves into memory. The forge itself became a kind of theater. The flames leaped and wavered, sometimes roaring with the breath of the bellows, sometimes subsiding into steady embers. Sparks shot outward in graceful arcs, like fleeting stars breaking across the night sky. The apprentices often felt small before this display, humbled by the raw energy of the elements. But in the midst of fire and chaos, the master stood, calm, moving with precision, as though he alone understood the language of the flames. To witness this was to glimpse the heart of the craft, control within disorder, order within fire. Observation required patience, and patience was its own discipline. The apprentices often stood for hours, their feet aching, their shoulders stiff, resisting the urge to shift or fidget. The master rarely explained his movements as he worked. Words were scarce in the forge. Instead, apprentices were expected to pay attention, to memorize by sight and sound. A careless blink might mean missing the exact moment the iron shifted. Color, the precise shade of orange that marked readiness for shaping. A wandering thought might cause them to miss the subtle way the master adjusted the hammer's angle to strike along the grain of the metal. And so, the apprentices learned to watch with more than their eyes. They watched with their bodies, absorbing the rhythm in their bones. They watched with their ears, hearing the music of hammer and fire. They watched with their breath, unconsciously, matching the slow, steady inhalations of the master, who never wasted motion even in breathing. This was learning without speaking. Knowledge passed through silence, skill taught in the space between hammer strokes. The master himself had once stood in their place. Every blacksmith was first an apprentice, and every apprentice a silent observer before they became a maker. This awareness gave depth to the act of watching. When apprentices saw the master's hands move with confidence, they knew that those Hands had once trembled with inexperience. When they saw him strike with precision, they understood that precision had been carved into him by long years of mistakes corrected, of repetition endured. Watching the master was not watching was watching the living memory of persistence. Sometimes, the master would pause and hold the iron up, letting it cool slightly before the next strike. In those pauses, apprentices leaned forward unconsciously, hungry for detail. The glowing bar of metal seemed alive, pulsing faintly with light. The master might test it with the touch of the hammer, listening not only to the sound of the strike, but to the feel in his hand. Apprentices learned that forging was not only sight and sound, but also touch. That true skill rested in the invisible sensation of resistance, the subtle give of heated metal beneath steel. They could not feel it themselves yet, but in watching the master, they began to imagine it, to anticipate it, until one day their own hands would know. At other times, the workshop fell into near silence, save for the crackle of the fire. The apprentices stood still, watching the master sharpen a blade or draw out a hinge. These were moments of intimacy, when the craft revealed its finer side. Not every task was about strength and fire. Some required delicacy, almost tenderness. The master's hammer, capable of splitting iron with force, could also caress the metal into smoothness, coaxing it rather than commanding it. To watch this gentleness was to understand that blacksmithing was not brute force but balance. There was, too, the lesson of endurance. Apprentices learned that the master never rushed. Even when the day grew long or the orders piled high, he paced himself, striking steadily, pausing when needed, always maintaining the rhythm of sustainable labor. The fire was relentless, the iron unyielding, yet the master showed that persistence did not mean recklessness. Apprentices watching him came to understand that their own impatience was the true enemy. The forge rewarded those who endured, who could stand the heat, who could wait for the right moment rather than seize the wrong one in haste. As the day wore on, shadows lengthened in the workshop. The apprentices still watched, their clothes now carrying the scent of soot, their faces warmed by the forge. Fatigue settled in, but the lessons continued. Every new piece of iron brought fresh opportunity. The shaping of a nail, the bending of a hinge, the careful drawing of a blade. Each task, though small, was performed with the same attention to detail. Apprentices realized that there were no unimportant pieces of work. A simple nail, shaped well, carried the same pride as a sword. This, too, they learned from observation, respect for every task, no matter its scale. By evening, when the forge dimmed and the last strikes echoed into silence, the apprentices carried with them not only the memory of what they had seen, but the beginnings of understanding. They had not touched the tools, but their minds had touched the craft. They had not shaped iron, but iron had already begun shaping them. Observation was not passive, it was an apprenticeship of the senses, an education in humility, patience, and the steady gaze required of any who would one day become masters themselves. And so, in the theater of the forge, the apprentices learned. They stood in silence, not knowing when their turn would come, but trusting that it would. They listened to the heartbeat of hammer on anvil. They watched the sparks fall like stars. They breathed in the scent of transformation. All of it entered them, quietly, invisibly, until they too would step forward, take the hammer, and repeat. The rhythm. Watching was their beginning, and through watching, they became part of the endless chain of craft passed from hand to hand, from master to apprentice, from silence to creation. The moment when an apprentice first stepped forward to the anvil was one of quiet significance. It did not arrive suddenly, nor did it come with fanfare. Instead, it was the slow reward of patience, the culmination of countless hours spent watching, sweeping, listening, and memorizing. For months, sometimes years, the apprentice's role had been one of silence and observation. They stood at the edges of the forge, eyes fixed on the master, absorbing rhythm and motion. Now, when the time came to place their hands on the tools and stand before the glowing anvil, they carried with them not only eagerness but also the weight of responsibility. To strike iron was no longer to watch a story unfold, but to begin writing one. The first tasks were deliberately small. Apprentices were not trusted with swords, plows, or wagon axles. They began with nails, hooks, and hinges, humble pieces, yet vital to the daily life of any village or town. A nail might seem insignificant, no larger than a fingertip, but to shape it from iron required control, timing, and an understanding of heat. the apprentice learned that even the smallest object carried the dignity of the craft. Nails held houses. Together, secured doors, bound wheels, and fixed hinges. A poorly made nail could weaken a structure, while a strong one might endure for generations. In this way, the apprentice discovered that the smallest tasks were also the most essential. The ritual began with fire. The apprentice, guided by the master's stern eye, slid a small rod of iron into the heart of the coals. They pumped the bellows, watching as the dull metal shifted color, first a faint red, then a deeper glow, until the bar reached the brightness of sunrise. The master would stand nearby, sometimes silent, sometimes murmuring a reminder, not too hot, not too cold, steady your hand. The apprentice felt their pulse quicken, for in the glow of the iron was the knowledge that a moment too late or too early would ruin the attempt. Heat was both ally and adversary. When the iron was ready, it was pulled from the fire with tongs and placed on the anvil. The hammer, heavier than it had ever seemed in practice, was lifted and brought down. The sound rang out, sharp and startling, echoing in the apprentice's bones. Sparks leaped into the air like fireflies scattering into darkness. At first, the strikes were clumsy. The hammer landed off-center, sometimes glancing, sometimes too light, sometimes too heavy. The iron bent awkwardly, its edges uneven. The master's voice would cut through the ringing. Again, lift, steady, strike with the wrist, not the arm. Feel the rhythm, do not chase speech's accuracy. In those first hours, failure was frequent. Nails bent, hooks split, hinges warped. The apprentice felt frustration rise like heat in the chest, but alongside it grew determination. For each flawed attempt, there was a chance to improve. The forge was a place where mistakes were not hidden but transformed. An iron piece gone wrong could be reheated, reshaped, and struck anew. Apprentices learned resilience not from success, but from error. Each crooked nail hammered their patience as surely as the hammer struck iron. The master corrected constantly. Sometimes his words were gentle, guiding like a steady hand on the shoulder. Other times they were sharp, echoing louder than the hammer itself. But whether gentle or stern, correction always carried purpose. The master was not there to praise or to scold for its own sake, but to shape character as much as iron. Apprentices came to understand that every correction was a form of care, proof that their work mattered enough to be made right. There was a strange pride in even the simplest creation. When, at last, a nail emerged, straight and sharp, or a hook curved smoothly without crack or twist, the apprentice felt a satisfaction deeper than words. This was not the fleeting pride of play or pastime, but the enduring pride of creation. Something once formless had taken shape beneath their own hands. The object was small, but the accomplishment was immense. That nail might fasten a cart, that hinge might secure a chest, that hook might hold a lantern in the night. Each carried usefulness, and usefulness gave meaning. Days passed, and the apprentices repeated these tasks endlessly. Nail after nail, hook after hook, hinge after hinge. To an outsider, the work might have seemed monotonous, but within repetition lived mastery. The apprentices discovered that no two strikes were ever quite the same. No two pieces of iron responded in exactly the same way. Each repetition was a lesson in subtlety, in reading the faint signs of heat and resistance. The forge became less a place of repetition and more a place of deepening awareness. Slowly, the hammer grew lighter in their hands. The timing of the strikes grew steadier. The sparks no longer startled. The rhythm became part of them. Patience was the true master here. Apprentices discovered that speed was dangerous. A hurried strike warped the piece. A rushed quench cracked the metal. True mastery lay in waiting for the right glow of the iron, in striking with control rather than force, in knowing when to stop as much as when to begin. The forge demanded humility. It reminded apprentices that eagerness could not replace endurance, and that skill was not a gift given overnight, but a slow accumulation carved into muscle and memory. In the quiet hours of the forge, the apprentices often reflected on the meaning of these small tasks. To shape nails and hooks was not merely to learn technique. It was to learn respect for material, for process, for tradition. The iron did not forgive arrogance. It bent to patience, not to pride. In this way, the apprentices were shaped as surely as the objects they forged. Their hands grew calloused, their shoulders strong, but more importantly, their spirits grew steady. Evenings brought weariness, yet also quiet satisfaction. Apprentices would sweep the floors once more, gathering the scattered sparks and iron shavings. They placed their finished pieces on the bench, sometimes few in number, sometimes flawed, but always representing progress. The master would glance at them, nodding slightly if they were worthy, setting them aside for reworking if not. Each nod was a victory, each correction a step forward. In this silent exchange between master and apprentice, respect grew. Over time, the apprentices began to see the forge not just as a place of fire and labor, but as a place of belonging. Each nail hammered was a thread binding them to the centuries of smiths who had come before. Each hinge shaped was a reminder that craft was not about glory, but about service of providing what was needed, however small, however unnoticed. The satisfaction of a well-made nail was quiet, but it was enduring. And in that quiet endurance, apprentices learned the essence of their path. Months blended into years, and the small tasks continued. They remained the foundation, even as the apprentices slowly advanced to larger projects. No matter how skilled they became, the lessons of nails and hooks remained etched in their hands. Mastery was not a single moment of triumph, but 1,000 small victories stacked upon each other, each one earned at the anvil, each one tested in fire. And so, in shaping small tasks, the apprentices shaped themselves, finding pride not in speed, not in grandeur, but in the patient accumulation of skill that would one day make them worthy of the title of smith. When the bells tolled noon and the air outside shimmered faintly with the heat of the sun, the forge grew still. The steady rhythm of hammers striking anvils fell silent, the breath of the bellows ceased, and the fire was left to glow quietly in its bed of coals. For a moment, the workshop seemed to exhale after long hours of labor. Apprentices, their hands streaked with soot and their clothes marked by ash, set tools aside with care. The pause was not just for rest, but for the ritual of nourishment, for even the hardest iron must yield to the rhythm of the body. Hunger was not an interruption to the day's work. It was a part of its pattern, a reminder that the forge was sustained not only by fuel and fire, but by bread, porridge, and stew. The apprentices joined the blacksmith's household for the midday meal. In most villages and towns, the forge was not a detached place of business, but a living part of a home. The master's house was often attached to or built close beside the workshop. The same chimney might serve both hearth and forge, carrying the smoke of cooking alongside the smoke of smelting. At midday, when the call of hunger stirred, the apprentices crossed from the dark workshop into the modest light of the family's hall or kitchen. Here, the world shifted. The clangor of tools gave way to the crackle of firewood, and the sharp scent of hot iron yielded to the gentler aroma of simmering food. Meals were rarely elaborate. They were plain but sustaining, suited to the rhythm of work that demanded endurance more than luxury. Porridge, thick with oats or barley, provided warmth and weight in the belly. Potajan, ever-changing stew, of grains, vegetables, and whatever meat or herbs could be spared, was ladled from clay pots into wooden bowls. Bread was ever present, coarse and dark, torn into pieces and dipped into broth. Cheese, often firm and salty, was shared in modest slices, and sometimes butter softened the crusts of bread when the household was fortunate enough to have it. On rare days, perhaps after a successful trade or festival, a bit of cured meat or fresh fruit might appear, but for most meals, simplicity was the rule. Apprentices learned to value this simplicity. Hunger gave flavor to plain fare, and the act of sharing transformed the meal into something more than nourishment. They sat at the rough wooden table beside the master's family, sometimes shoulder to shoulder with the master himself, sometimes at the benches along the wall. The blacksmith's wife might serve the bowls, and children of the household, if there were any, might sit among the apprentices, their chatter softening the stern atmosphere carried over from the forge. For a time, the hierarchy of master and apprentice was suspended. They were not hammer in hand, command and obedience, but simply people sharing food, bound together by the same hunger and the same need for rest. Conversations at these meals were often quiet, shaped by the fatigue of the morning's labor. Some days the room was filled with the simple sound of chewing, the scrape of spoons in bowls, the occasional clink of a knife against a plate. Other days, voices rose gently in small talk. Apprentices might murmur to each other about the tasks of the morning, how the iron had resisted, how the hammer had rung, how sparks had startled. The master might share a word about orders to be filled, carts to be repaired, or neighbors to be supplied. Children might interrupt with questions or stories of play, bringing lightness to the table. But rarely was the talk excessive. The forge encouraged restraint, and even in the home, meals were as much about quiet sustenance as about fellowship. The smells of the kitchen mingled with the forge. Soot clung to the apprentices' hair and hands, and the faint metallic tang of iron seemed to follow them no matter where they sat. Yet over these sharper scents drifted the comfort of food, the earthy steam of boiling barley, the sweetness of onions stewing in broth, the nutty aroma of bread cooling by the hearth. These simple fragrances softened the weariness in the apprentices' bones. A spoonful of hot porridge restored strength to the arms that had wielded the hammer. A bite of bread steadied the mind, dulled by smoke and heat. Each mouthful seemed to remind them that, while their craft relied on iron and fire, their bodies remained rooted in earth and grain. For apprentices far from their own homes, these meals offered a sense of belonging. Many had left families behind in distant villages to enter their years of service. In the forge, they were students and servants, bound to discipline and correction. But at the table, they were welcomed into the rhythm of family life. The master's household might never replace their own families, but the warmth of shared bread, the passing of bowls, and the murmured blessing before eating gave apprentices a place in the circle. They became not only workers of the forge, but members, however, temporary of a household that included them in its daily cycle of work, rest, and sustenance. The midday meal was also a time for observation of a different kind. Apprentices, who had spent the morning studying the master's hands at the anvil, now studied his gestures at the table, how he broke his bread, how he offered the first bowl to his wife or child, how he paused before eating. These small acts were lessons in respect, humility, and order. To be a blacksmith was not only to master iron but to master conduct, and the home was as much a classroom as the forge. Apprentices learned that the strength of a craftsman was measured not only in the hammer's strike, but also in the way he lived among others. There was a rhythm to these meals, a pacing that matched the day itself. At first, the eating was brisk, driven by hunger. Then it slowed, conversation filling the spaces between bites. Finally, silence returned, a contented hush that spread as bowls emptied and hands rested. In that silence, apprentices felt the heaviness of food settle comfortably in their bodies, a weight that promised energy for the afternoon's work. The pause was not merely physical, but mental, a chance to breathe, to let thoughts drift away from iron and fire, to sit in stillness before returning once more to labor. Sometimes, the midday meal stretched beyond food into moments of rest. An apprentice might lean back on the bench, eyes half closed, listening to the soft crackle of the hearth. A child's laughter might echo in the background, mingling with the sound of doves or sparrows outside the window. These moments reminded the apprentices that life extended beyond the forge. The world was not only the glow of fire and the ring of steel, but also the warmth of soup, the comfort of bread, and the laughter of others. In these pauses, they found balance, a reminder that work and rest were two halves of the same whole. On feast days or special occasions, the meal took on greater significance. The table might hold roasted meat, fresh vegetables, or sweetened pastries. Wine or ale might be shared in modest cups. On such days, apprentices felt the rare joy of abundance. These meals lingered longer, voices growing louder, laughter spilling more freely. Yet even in these moments of celebration, the apprentices carried the quiet understanding that the forge awaited them. Food was joy, but it was also fuel. The day would end as it always did, with iron, fire, and sweat. Over months and years, the memory of these meals accumulated. Apprentices carried them as warmly as they carried the lessons of the anvil. They remembered the smell of stew mingling with soot, the texture of coarse bread in their hands, the sound of bowls being set upon the table. These memories lingered long after apprenticeship ended, perhaps even more vividly than the tasks of forging nails or shaping hooks. For the midday meal was not just a break in labor, it was a reminder of humanity within the rhythm of craft. In the grand sweep of history, such meals might seem small, unworthy of record. Yet they were the threads that bound daily life, weaving apprentices into households and grounding them in the simple truth that craft could not exist without sustenance. The forge demanded strength, but strength was nourished in humble kitchens, over bowls of porridge and slices of bread. And so the midday meal became a quiet cornerstone of apprenticeship, teaching lessons not of iron and fire, but of patience, gratitude, and belonging. The afternoon began slowly. almost reluctantly, as if the forge itself needed time to awaken after the midday pause. The fire banked during the meal was stirred back to life with the steady pull of the bellows. Coals glowed red, then orange, and at last flared into the familiar white heat that made iron pliable. The air thickened again with smoke and warmth, and soon the workshop returned to its natural voice, the hiss of fire, the ring of hammer upon anvil, the creak of leather, the murmur of voices. Apprentices, refreshed from bread and broth, stepped back into their roles. The morning's tasks had sharpened their focus, but it was in the afternoons that endurance was tested. Afternoons stretched long, yet they carried their own peculiar rhythm. The sun climbed high, spilling light through the shutters in shifting beams that moved across the packed earth floor as hours passed. Dust hung in the air, visible only where the sunlight caught it, drifting like tiny sparks that mimicked the bursts from hammer-struck iron. Sweat gathered quickly again, rolling down brows, soaking into tunics, streaking soot-darkened faces. The forge was no cooler than before, but after the stillness of the midday meal, the noise and heat felt newly alive, almost invigorating. The rhythm of the work defined the hours. The hammer rose and fell in steady cadence, its strike neither rushed nor sluggish, but balanced, almost musical. The bellows sighed and groaned with each pull, feeding the fire with patient breath. Tongs clinked against iron, the scrape of files added texture, and footsteps echoed softly as apprentices moved from water trough to bench, from anvil to coal bin. These sounds blended into a harmony that belonged entirely to the forge. To an outsider, it might have seemed monotonous. To those within, it was a kind of chant, steady and reassuring. Apprentices learned in these hours that mastery lay not in bursts of brilliance, but in the quiet persistence of repetition. Each strike of the hammer was both familiar and new-shaping, correcting, coaxing. They began with simple pieces, nails, hooks, brackets. These were small tasks, but repetition gave them weight. One nail became 100, each slightly different, each teaching a lesson about angle, about force, about patience. Hooks bent too sharply or too gently had to be redone. Brackets warped under uneven pressure demanded correction. The afternoon taught that craft was built not on speed, but on steadiness. There was a calmness hidden in this persistence. Apprentices often lost awareness of time, absorbed in the cycle of heating, hammering, cooling, and shaping. The hours seemed to slip by without notice, measured not by clocks, but by the slow drift of sunlight across the shutters. A shaft of brightness at one moment struck the far wall, then later angled lower, then vanished altogether as evening approached. The forge marked its own hours, its rhythm bound not to minutes and seconds, but to the patience of work itself. Sweat trickled endlessly, yet it did not disturb the rhythm. It became part of the forge's language, just as smoke-stung eyes, calloused palms, and aching arms became familiar companions. Apprentices grew used to the discomfort, even welcoming it as proof of their labor. In time, the pain dulled, leaving only a quiet endurance that carried them forward. Each task accomplished, a hinge shaped, a blade trued, a nail completed brought a muted satisfaction. It was not the joy of triumph, but the calm pride of progress, of knowing that each afternoon's persistence edged them closer to skill. The master moved among them, his presence steady but not oppressive. He did not hover, yet his eyes missed little. A poorly angled hammer blow, a misjudged heat, a careless quench, all earned correction. Sometimes a sharp word, sometimes only a glance. Apprentices learned that the master's silence was not indifference but trust, and his intervention was not rebuke but guidance. In the afternoon light, they understood that he too was part of the rhythm, his movements as practiced and reliable as theirs aspired to be. The forge itself seemed to breathe with them. When the bellows pulled, the coals brightened. When the hammer struck, sparks leaped into the dim air. When the iron hissed in the water trough, steam rose in curling tendrils that carried the faint scent of scorched metal. These small patterns repeated endlessly, and apprentices found themselves moving within them almost unconsciously, their own bodies joining the cycle. They became part of the forge's pulse, their labor blending with the fire's life. Some afternoons brought specific challenges. A farmer might arrive needing tools repaired before the fields demanded attention. A cartwright might bring broken wheel rims or axles, demanding both speed and care. These tasks pressed the apprentices harder, forcing them to apply what they had learned under the watchful eye of the master. Mistakes meant delays, and delays could mean displeasure from those who relied on the forge. In these moments, the rhythm quickened slightly, yet even then it retained its steadiness. Apprentices discovered that calm persistence was the surest answer to urgency. Other afternoons were quieter, the work less demanding. On such days, the forge felt almost meditative. Apprentices fell into near silence, save for the natural voice of hammer and fire. The repetition lulled the mind into a state that was not quite thoughtless but not cluttered either. It was a clarity born of focus, a quiet that lived within the noise. In those hours, the apprentices felt a strange peace, as though the forge carried them along, its rhythm both demanding and soothing. The sunlight dimmed gradually as the afternoon stretched toward evening. Shadows lengthened across the floor, and the glow of the forge seemed to grow brighter by contrast. The apprentices noticed the shift, not with impatience but with quiet acceptance. Time in the forge was not a burden to be endured, but a river to be carried along. They did not count hours, for the hours counted themselves in tasks completed, in iron-shaped, in the progress that came from persistence. Fatigue crept in, of course. Arms grew heavy, backs stiffened, eyes blurred with smoke. But even this became part of the rhythm. Fatigue was not failure, but proof of labor, a natural partner to progress. Apprentices learned to work through it, not with reckless force but with steady endurance. They discovered that the body, like iron, could be shaped by persistence. Strength came not in sudden bursts, but in the slow, steady accumulation of effort, day after day, hour after hour. In the end, the afternoons taught apprentices something deeper than craft. They revealed the value of patience, the necessity of endurance, and the quiet satisfaction that came from steady work. The forge did not demand brilliance, it demanded constancy. And constancy, in time, became its own reward. When the last shafts of sunlight faded from the shutters and the shadows deepened, the rhythm of the afternoon began to slow. Hammers struck less often, the bellows were pulled with less urgency, and the fire, though still alive, burned lower. Apprentices felt the shift within themselves too, a natural easing that mirrored the world outside. The day was not yet done, but its pace softened, guiding them gently toward the evening. For apprentices, the memory of these afternoons lingered long beyond their years of training. The rhythm of hammer and fire, the persistence of small tasks, the calm passage of hours, they carried these lessons into all corners of life. They understood that patience was not mere waiting, but active endurance. That progress was not measured in leaps, but in steady steps. That time, when filled with purpose, could slip by almost unnoticed. The forge had taught them these truths, not in words, but in rhythm, in sound, in sweat. And so the afternoons stretched on, day after day, season after season, each alike, each different, each weaving its own thread into the fabric of apprenticeship. The forge, with its heat and its rhythm, became not only a place of work, but a teacher of time itself. For in the long, steady hours of afternoon labor, apprentices learned what it meant to move with care, to endure, and to find quiet satisfaction in the simple persistence of craft. Life in the workshop unfolded not only in the rhythm of days but also in the slow turning of the seasons. And for the apprentices, each shift in weather brought with it lessons as profound as any struck upon the anvil. In winter, the forge became a sanctuary, its heat a shelter against the biting cold that pressed hard from the outside world. Apprentices arrived at the workshop with stiff fingers, breath clouding in the air, and cloaks dusted with frost, but once inside, the forge wrapped them in its embrace. The heat of the coals thawed numbed hands, and the flames became a source of comfort as much as of labor. Work in winter carried its own rhythm, slower in the mornings when the fire was coaxed to life, then steady as the day wore on. While outside, the village huddled against the long nights. The windows of the forge glowed like lanterns in the early dusk, and the sound of hammering carried through the frosted air like a steady heartbeat in the stillness of snow. Apprentices remembered those months, not just for the cold endured, but for the strange contentment found in the forge's warmth, where work continued even as nature seemed to sleep. Yet winter also demanded endurance, for the cold clung to them whenever they stepped outside, and sometimes even the forge's heat could not chase away the chill that lingered in their bones. But it was in those moments of difficulty that the forge revealed itself as more than a place of labor. It became a reminder of resilience, of warmth maintained in the face of hardship. With the arrival of spring, the workshop shifted again, and the apprentices felt the season most clearly not in the forge itself, but in the world that pressed against its doors. Mud clung to their boots as the thaw released the earth, and the scent of damp soil mingled with the smoke of the hearth. Birds returned to the eaves, their songs drifting into the workshop through open shutters, a music that mingled with the ring of hammer and the hiss of quenching iron. Spring brought a restlessness, a stirring energy that seemed to echo in the apprentices themselves. After the long stillness of winter, they worked with renewed vigor, the tasks familiar but somehow lighter, buoyed by the promise of warmer days. Farmers came to the forge in greater numbers, bringing plowshares and tools in need of repair for the coming planting, and so the rhythm of labor quickened, tied directly to the cycles of the land. Apprentices learned that their craft was not isolated from the world outside, but woven into it. For every hinge shaped, every nail hammered, every tool mended became part of the wider life of the village. The forge's fire was constant, but spring reminded them that constancy lived within change, and that the seasons themselves were as much a teacher as the master's hand. Summer, however, tested them in ways no winter frost could match. The forge, already a place of unrelenting heat, grew nearly unbearable under the long days of sun. Apprentices stripped to their lightest garments, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, their arms glistening as they labored in the sweltering air. The fire seemed fiercer, the air thicker, and even the simple act of breathing felt weighted. Yet still, the work endured. The master expected no less, and the apprentices learned that patience was not only the acceptance of time's passage, but the acceptance of discomfort. The ability to press forward, even when every breath burned hot and every muscle cried for rest. The afternoons of summer seemed endless, the sun slow to fall, the hours stretching long across the earth. But within the forge, the rhythm of hammer and fire remained the same. Apprentices endured, and in that endurance, they discovered a strength that winter had not asked of them. The heat of summer shaped not only iron, but character, teaching them that true mastery was not in avoiding hardship, but in carrying on despite it. And when evening finally came, when the shutters opened to let in a breeze cooled by the fading sun, the relief was all the sweeter, a reminder that labor's trials were always met by moments of rest. Autumn arrived with its own lessons, softer than summer, but no less profound. The air cooled, carrying the crisp scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and apprentices walked to the workshop through fields stripped of harvest, their boots crunching on dry soil. The forge in autumn felt balanced, its heat no longer oppressive but steady, its rhythm matched by the turning of the world outside. The evenings grew longer, shadows stretching earlier across the workshop floor, and apprentices worked with the awareness that the year was drawing to its close. Farmers brought fewer tools, carts arrived less frequently, and the rush of spring and summer gave way to quieter days. Yet within that quiet came reflection. Apprentices looked back on the months before, remembering the cold endured in winter, the mud of spring, the sweat of summer, and now the calm of autumn. Each season had carried them forward, shaping them as surely as hammer and fire shaped the iron beneath their hands. In autumn, they felt that truth most keenly, for the world itself seemed to pause, to settle, preparing once more for the long sleep of winter. The cycle of the seasons became more than a backdrop. It became a rhythm that intertwined with the rhythm of the forge. Apprentices came to understand that their lives were not measured only in tasks completed or years served, but in the turning of seasons, each bringing its own lessons, each binding them more firmly to their craft. They remembered winter for its endurance, spring for its renewal, summer for its persistence, and autumn for its quiet reflection. Together, these shifts in time shaped them not only as blacksmiths but as people, rooted in the natural world as firmly as in their trade. The forge did not stand apart from the seasons it lived within them, and in living within them, the apprentices too became part of the turning year. The memory of these seasonal shifts stayed with them long after apprenticeship ended, when they themselves became masters, or when they carried their craft to new villages. They remembered the bite of winter air against soot-streaked cheeks, the mud of spring thick on their boots, the sweat of summer dripping from their brows, the crisp breath of autumn evenings as the forge glowed like a hearth against the darkening world. These memories were not mere details. They were part of the story of their labor, part of the lesson of endurance, patience, and belonging. For to be a smith was not only to shape iron, but to live in harmony with the turning seasons, to find within each shift a reminder of what it meant to endure, to persist, to grow. And so the seasons turned, year after year, their rhythm as steady as the hammer's strike, as inevitable as the fading of sunlight through the workshop shutters. The apprentices lived within that rhythm, shaped by it, carrying it with them into every corner of their lives, until the memory of those shifts became as enduring as the craft itself. As the light of day slipped away and the sun's golden edge sank beneath rooftops and fields, the apprentices knew their work was not yet fully done, for the ending of labor carried its own rituals as sacred as the day's beginning. The forge, which for hours had thundered with heat and hammer, gradually grew quieter, and in that quiet the apprentices took up their last tasks with steady care. Tidying the workshop was never rushed, never treated as an afterthought, but as a responsibility that bound them not only to their master, but to the very dignity of their craft. Tools, once scattered across benches or leaned haphazardly against the anvil, were gathered in hand, wiped of soot, and returned to their places. Apprentices learned early that tools were more than mere objects. They were companions in labor, each with a purpose, each deserving of respect. A chisel, dulled by the day's work, was not tossed aside but examined, cleaned, perhaps sharpened if time allowed. Hammers, their wooden handles darkened by sweat and iron dust, were brushed clean and rested back on their racks in neat order. Even the smallest nail punch or tong was accounted for, each one touched by the apprentice's hand as if to confirm that nothing of value was forgotten in the fading light. The sweeping of ash became a quiet act of meditation. From dawn to dusk, the floor collected fragments of the day, sparks fallen like fleeting stars, flecks of iron chipped away with each strike, and the ever-present dust of coal that drifted and settled in dark layers across stone and wood alike. Apprentices took up brooms worn smooth by daily use, their strokes steady, rhythmic, like a softer echo of the hammer's earlier music. Dust rose in pale clouds and shimmered in the lantern glow, catching the dim remnants of light as if the air itself held on to the memory of fire. For the apprentices, sweeping was not drudgery but a lesson, one repeated with each passing day. It reminded them that no craft was noble if it was careless, and that order was the foundation upon which skill could flourish. A clean floor, a tidy bench, a well-damped fire, these were not trivial details but the marks of discipline, the quiet truths of mastery. Buckets of water were lifted with weary arms, their wooden staves creaking, and poured across the stone floor to hold down the last of the dust. The splash of water was cool against ankles, still warm from the forge, the scent of wet stone mingling with the lingering tang of smoke and iron. Apprentices knelt to scrub where soot had settled too thick, or where oil had spilled, black streaks smudging the stone. They worked until the floor bore the marks, not of neglect but of steady care, each scrape and scrub a gesture of respect for the place that had shaped them. The forge itself demanded the greatest care of all. The fire that had roared bright and hot was coaxed down with patience, embers stirred and spread, coal gently dampened to prevent stray sparks from leaping in the night. Apprentices watched as the once blazing heart of the workshop dimmed to a soft glow, fading like the last pulse of sunlight on the horizon. There was a solemnity in this act, as though they were laying the forge to rest, ensuring that it slept safely until morning called it to life again. Lanterns were lit as darkness crept in, their small flames flickering on beams blackened by years of smoke. Shadows lengthened across the walls, stretching tall and wavering, and apprentices worked in the half-light with movements careful, deliberate, knowing the day's final impression mattered as much as its first. Silence often accompanied this hour, broken only by the scrape of broom bristles, the soft clang of iron returned to its place, or the faint hiss of embers settling under dampened coal. At times, light conversation drifted, quiet remarks shared, between apprentices who had labored side by side since dawn, their voices carrying a tone of relief, of gentleness, after hours of focus and discipline. Yet, even in those moments, the work remained careful, never careless. For the master's eye lingered on the order of the shop, and more than that, the apprentices themselves came to take pride in the neatness they left behind. Evening duties held a rhythm of their own, distinct from the bustle of day, where the morning brimmed with energy and the afternoon pulsed with endurance. The evening invited reflection. Apprentices moved slower, not from idleness but from intention, each action deliberate, each step marking closure. They began to notice details overlooked in the rush of labor, the way light pooled on the iron bands of a barrel, the faint crackle of cooling metal, the warmth that still radiated from stones near the hearth. In these moments, the workshop revealed itself not only as a place of labor, but as a living space, one that breathed with them, responded to them, and grew orderly again under their hands. Tidying became an act of gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement that the forge had served them well through another day, and now it was their turn to serve it in return. There was a symbolic weight to ending the day in order. To leave a hammer rusting in a damp corner, to abandon ash piled thick on the floor, to let the forge smolder recklessly into the night. These were not just signs of negligence, but failures of respect. Apprentices understood, sometimes through stern correction, that disorder was dangerous as well as dishonorable. A stray ember could spark flame in the dark. A misplaced tool could injure an unwary hand come morning. Thus, the discipline of evening duties was also a discipline of foresight, a recognition that tomorrow's labor was made smoother by today's care. Apprentices, though weary, learned that skill was not only in the strike of a hammer, but in the quiet humility of cleaning after it. When the last broom was hung, when the final tool was set in place, when the forge lay hushed and the floor damp and cool, a silence settled over the workshop that felt different from the silence of early dawn. This was not the silence of anticipation, but of closure, a stillness that carried the weight of effort now completed. Apprentices paused to feel it, some leaning against benches, others stretching weary arms, their faces faintly lit by lanterns swinging gently in the draught. Outside, the evening deepened, carrying the smells of hearth smoke and damp earth, the muffled sounds of villagers settling into their own nightly routines. Within, the apprentices stood in a space now orderly, their work behind them, their duties fulfilled, and in that moment, they shared a quiet satisfaction. These routines, repeated day after day, etched themselves into memory. Years later, when apprentices grew into journeymen or masters, they would recall not only the grand lessons of forging iron, but also the smaller lessons of sweeping ash and setting tools in order. They would remember how the fading light caught dust in the air, how embers glowed like fading stars, how silence filled the forge once work was done. These evening duties taught them that mastery was not only a matter of strength or skill, but of respect for tools, for fire, for the workshop itself, and perhaps most of all, for the rhythm of labor that bound each day together, beginning in dawn's promise and closing in evening's calm. For the apprentices, evening tidying was never a burden, but a grounding ritual, a gentle descent from the intensity of work to the quiet of rest. It reminded them that every day, however demanding, could end in order, in peace, in the soft glow of lantern light, and the satisfaction of a space well cared for. In this way, the forge was never truly silent, never merely abandoned to night, but carried forward by their hands, preserved in its dignity, ready to rise again with the coming of dawn. And so, as darkness settled, apprentices closed the workshop with the same steady reverence with which they had opened it. The circle of labor completed, the memory of the day sealed in the simple acts of sweeping, cleaning, and leaving the forge to rest. When the day's work had ended, when the forge was cleaned and the fire lay resting beneath its cover of dampened ash, the apprentices stepped beyond the boundaries of labor and entered those rare, delicate hours that belonged to them alone. These free hours, though few, carried a weight of comfort and meaning, for they stood apart from the discipline of the workshop and the stern eye of the master. In these moments, the apprentices learned the rhythm of rest, of small joys, of the gentle binding of companionship that flourished not in toil but in stillness. Some would linger outdoors, where the air, freed of coal dust, felt cool upon their sweat-streaked skin. The twilight sky, painted in strokes of fading gold and deepening blue, stretched above them, and the swallows, agile and swift, darted overhead, tracing patterns that seemed both playful and timeless. Watching them, the apprentices felt their own burdens lighten, as if the birds carried some fragment of their fatigue away on restless wings. Others would sit quietly on steps or low walls, their hands idly mending torn sleeves, patching worn knees, or adjusting the straps of shoes scuffed by long hours of standing. The work was simple, almost thoughtless, but it grounded them in a rhythm of care for themselves, as though to mend a garment was to reclaim a measure of dignity after a day spent serving another's craft. Some turned to small creations of their own trinkets, carved from scraps of wood, twisted wire shaped into crude rings, or stones rubbed smooth between tired palms until they shone with a soft polish. These objects were not made for profit, nor for praise, but for the quiet satisfaction of shaping something that belonged to them alone. Within the confines of apprenticeship, where nearly every action was directed by command or necessity, the act of choosing to create freely, even on the smallest scale, became a declaration of self. It reminded them that beneath the soot-stained faces and calloused hands, there remained a spark of individuality, a flame untamed by duty. For others, the free hours were not for activity, but for companionship. Apprentices gathered in twos or threes, sitting shoulder to shoulder on worn benches or leaning against the workshop's outer wall, voices dropping into softer tones. Now that no hammer's din forced them to shout, they shared stories half-remembered, from home, tales of family or village life, sometimes exaggerating for humor, sometimes whispering truths too fragile to speak aloud under the master's gaze. Laughter came easily then, not the boisterous laughter of taverns, but a gentler kind, born of shared weariness and the simple relief of belonging. For many, though, the greatest gift of these hours was stillness itself, to stretch one's arms wide, to lean back and feel the body's weight sink into rest, to breathe deeply without urgency. These were luxuries. Some closed their eyes and let the sounds of the evening wash over them, the distant lowing of cattle, the murmur of villagers returning home, the rustle of leaves stirred by an evening breeze. For a moment, the apprentices ceased to be learners or laborers. They were simply young souls, caught in the pause between obligation and sleep. It was in these pauses that the apprentices came to know themselves most honestly. In the forge, they were defined by their tasks, by how straight they held a hammer, how carefully they swept, how well they remembered the master's commands. But in their free hours, they discovered what lingered when duty loosened its grip. Some longed for home and spoke wistfully of mothers' voices or the smell of fields after rain. Others dreamed ahead, speaking of the day when they too might hold the title of master, imagining the shape of their own workshops, their own apprentices, their own lives carved from iron and persistence. Yet even dreaming was often subdued, softened by fatigue. The apprentices rarely planned great adventures in these twilight hours. Instead, they savored the nearness of each other's company, the tangible comfort of being understood by those who shared their burdens. A hand resting loosely on a knee, a quiet nod, a shared loaf of bread. These gestures spoke more deeply than words. Food, if any remained from the day, was passed around with little ceremony. Crumbs brushed from palms, bites taken slowly, the flavor heightened by hunger's honesty. A piece of cheese, slightly hardened, became a small treasure, savored with reverence. The apprentices knew that their lives were not filled with abundance, but in these moments, they also knew that scarcity did not mean emptiness. What little they had was amplified by the fact that it was shared, and sharing was itself a kind of feast. The hours slipped by gently, marked not by clocks but by the slow deepening of night. Lanterns were lit here and there across the village, their glow warm but distant, while stars emerged above in patient succession. Apprentices sometimes lay back on the ground, staring upward, their tired eyes tracing constellations barely remembered from stories told in childhood. The sky seemed impossibly vast, stretching far beyond the forge, beyond the village, beyond even the reach of imagination. For boys and girls who had spent their day enclosed by stone walls and wooden beams, the sight of endless sky was both humbling and liberating. It reminded them that life, though bound by apprenticeship now, contained horizons greater than the immediate circle of labor. Some felt hope stir quietly in their chests, others felt only the comfort of surrendering, thought to the immensity above. As the evening deepened, some apprentices sought solitude, wandering short distances from the forge to sit alone beside a stream or lean against the trunk of an old tree. In solitude, the sounds of the world grew sharper, the chirp of crickets, the faint lapping of water, the whisper of leaves. For those who carried private burdens, solitude gave space for silent tears, for whispered prayers, for moments of reflection too personal to share, even with companions. These hours, though gentle, were not always joyous. Sometimes they carried the weight of longing, of weariness too deep to voice. Yet even in sorrow, the apprentices found a measure of healing in the quiet. The forge demanded strength, but the evening allowed them the vulnerability of being simply human, fragile and yearning. When the apprentices returned to their quarters, whether late or early, they carried the residue of these free hours with them. Some drifted to sleep, still smiling from shared jokes, the sound of laughter lingering in dreams. Others lay awake, longer, turning over thoughts of family, of future, of self. Their minds still restless, even as their bodies begged for rest. But whether joyous or somber, the free hours left a mark, shaping their inner lives as surely as the forge shaped iron. They taught balance, that a life of labor required pauses, that the soul could not endure without moments of release, however brief, and so the apprentices guarded these hours carefully, treasuring them even when they seemed ordinary. They knew that within the narrow confines of apprenticeship, these fleeting freedoms were their only spaces to grow into themselves, to discover what they cherished, to imagine what they might become. Night closed gently around them, the village quieting, the forge sleeping, the stars holding silent watch. The apprentices, too, surrendered at last to rest, their bodies weary, their hearts a little lighter for the gift of freedom, however small. These hours might not have been long, nor filled with grandeur, yet they were enough to remind the apprentices that life was more than labor, that joy could be found in a shared glance, a quiet word, a breath of evening air beneath a sky of endless depth. And in that reminder lay strength, the kind of strength that carried them back into the forge at dawn, ready once more to face the heat, the hammer, and the unending rhythm of work. Learning did not end when the apprentices laid down their hammers or swept the forge floor clean. In truth, some of the most enduring lessons came not from the rhythm of metal upon anvil, but from the softer, subtler rhythms of life beyond the workshop walls. Apprenticeship was more than a trade. It was an initiation into the unspoken rules of community, into the hidden bonds that held a village together and gave shape to human belonging. To step beyond the forge was to step into another kind of classroom, one not marked by soot and sparks but by gestures, glances, rituals, and shared customs that revealed themselves slowly. As seasons passed and youth gave way to maturity, the apprentices learned by watching as much as by doing, absorbing the nuances of market exchanges, where goods were weighed not only in measures of grain or bundles of cloth, but also in the trust that passed between hands. They carried messages across narrow lanes, learning the careful tone with which a boy should speak to an elder, the way to wait respectfully before knocking at a door, the proper distance to keep when addressing a woman of standing. These small acts, repeated often enough, built in them a quiet awareness of how every word and gesture mattered, how community thrived not on noise but on courtesy. At festivals, when the forge stood silent for a rare day, the apprentices joined the currents of music and laughter that spilled through the streets. They were not at the center of such gatherings, for apprentices were still apprentices, their place humble, their pockets rarely full. But even from the margins they learned the art of belonging. They watched the dancers move in circles, stamping, feet against earth that had borne generations before them. They listened to the songs carried by weathered voices, songs that spoke of harvests, of hardships, of gods who guided the rains and the winds. And in the rhythm of those songs, in the warmth of the fires that lit the night, the apprentices began to feel themselves woven into something larger than the workshop, larger even than the village, the slow tapestry of human continuity in which each thread, however thin, had its place. They learned, too, the language of silence. Not every lesson was spoken, and not every truth was taught by words. The apprentices noticed how a neighbor bowed his head respectfully as the funeral bell tolled, how a mother pressed a loaf of bread into the hands of a hungry child without boasting of her generosity, how an elder paused to rest mid-journey yet carried himself with unbroken dignity. These quiet examples left marks as deep as any instruction from a master. In time, the apprentices understood that skill in a trade was only part of manhood or womanhood. To be truly respected was to embody patience, humility, and kindness in the spaces between work. The forge trained their hands, but the village trained their character. The marketplace was one of their greatest teachers. Sent there with errands, they first arrived shy and uncertain, clutching coins tightly in palms damp with sweat, rehearsing in their minds the words they would use to ask for flour or to measure a length of cord. At first, mistakes came, dropped, names forgotten, measures confused, but the villagers, patient with youth, corrected them gently. Over time, the apprentices grew more confident. learning not only how to speak clearly, but how to listen. They began to notice when a seller's smile hid weariness, when a lowered voice suggested a bargain, when silence meant that further haggling would be rude. Each exchange was a thread in their education, teaching them that value was not always measured in coin but also in fairness, in the respect that made tomorrow's trade possible. And beyond the clatter of stalls, the apprentices observed the life of the village unfolding, children darting between legs with laughter, farmers returning with muddy boots, travelers pausing to share tidings of distant places. In these glimpses, the apprentices saw the broader world to which they belonged, a reminder that the forge was only one fire among many that kept the village alive. At festivals, their learning took a different shape. Here, the apprentices discovered joy as a form of instruction, the art of loosening the shoulders, of letting the feet move in time with drum beats, of allowing the heart to swell with the collective rhythm of celebration. They tasted honey cakes and cider, foods richer than their daily fare, and learned how to savor sweetness without greed. They watched couples court with glances and shy smiles, and in those unspoken exchanges, they began to sense how affection bloomed quietly, as patient and deliberate as any craft. They joined processions, carrying lanterns or garlands, their steps matching those of neighbors, the whole village moving as one body beneath the moon. From these nights, they carried back not only memories of light and laughter, but also an understanding that work alone could not sustain a life. Community was nourished as much by joy as by labor. Apprentices also learned the art of modest speech. In the forge, they might be scolded sharply, expected to accept correction without protest. Beyond its doors, they carried this discipline into their interactions with villagers, speaking carefully, measuring their words with respect. Elders, they learned, valued modesty more than cleverness. A boast might earn laughter among peers, but would bring only disapproval from those who measured character by humility. So they trained themselves to answer questions plainly, to offer thanks often, to listen longer than they spoke. In this, they discovered a truth, that quiet pride carried farther than loud self-praise. To walk through the village with the bearing of a tradesman, head high, shoulders steady, words measured, was to carry the dignity of the forge into the wider world. And so, even when no hammer rang, the apprentices still bore the invisible weight of their craft. Seasons deepened their lessons. In spring, the apprentices helped carry buckets of water to fields, or aided neighbors in clearing debris left by winter storms, learning that strength was lent as freely as it was earned. In summer, they saw how festivals blended work with celebration, harvest preparations mixing with dances and songs. In autumn, they joined in gathering wood, aware that every stack of logs meant warmth for families in the months to come. In winter, they felt the closeness of community most keenly, huddling in rooms where stories were told and bread was shared, learning that survival itself was a collective act. With each cycle, their awareness grew. Apprenticeship was not isolation, but integration, each individual effort braided into the broader life of the village. They also discovered that learning beyond the forge included failure. There were moments of clumsy speech, of disrespect given without intention, of misunderstandings that brought laughter or gentle rebuke. An apprentice might forget to bow to an elder, might stumble in carrying a message accurately, might speak too boldly at a festival dance. Yet these mistakes, embarrassing as they seemed, became teachers in themselves. In stumbling, the apprentices learned to rise with grace. In being corrected, they learned to accept guidance without shame. The community, patient and firm, offered lessons not in books or formal lectures, but in living examples, in the everyday corrections that shaped character more surely than hammer blows shaped iron. Over the years, the apprentices came to see that every hour outside the forge was part of their training. The way they greeted a neighbor, the way they joined in song, the way they shared bread, all were threads in the same tapestry. To be a blacksmith was not only to know the secrets of fire and iron, but to embody the values of steadiness, fairness, and belonging. A tool poorly made might break, but so too might a reputation poorly tended. And so, the apprentices carried themselves carefully, knowing that their actions reflected not only on themselves but on their master, their trade, and their place within the village. In time, they realized that these lessons were not fleeting, but permanent, etched into memory like lines upon metal. Long after apprenticeship ended, long after they set up their own forges or moved to new villages, the habits of respect, modesty, and community would endure. They would remember the weight of coins in a market stall, the warmth of lantern light at a festival, the dignity of an elder's bowed head. These memories would guide their choices, tempering ambition with humility, skill with kindness, work with joy. Thus, the free hours beyond the forge were never wasted. They were as essential as the hours within it, shaping apprentices not only into craftsmen, but into whole human beings, bound to their community by invisible threads of duty, respect, and love. When night finally came, the town settled into a deep and unhurried stillness, a stillness that seemed to fold over the streets like a blanket, tucking away the noise of the day and replacing it with gentler sounds, faint echoes, and shadows that stretched long beneath the pale wash of moonlight. Lanterns glowed faintly at corners and along crooked alleys, their small flames wavering in glass, casting dim halos that made the cobblestones glisten like wet metal even when the ground was dry. Dogs barked in the distance, their voices carrying, across the quiet air, sometimes met by another answering bark from far away, as though even animals recognized that night was a time for calling out, but not for gathering. Shutters closed one by one, wooden slats drawn across windows as families pulled in against the night's chill, the clatter of the bolts clicking into place forming the last punctuation of the day. Apprentices returned to their quarters with slow steps, their boots scuffing against stone, their hands hanging tired at their sides, their clothes carrying the scent of smoke and iron that lingered long after the forge fires had been damped down. That smell became a mark of their days, as much a part of their bodies as sweat or the calluses on their palms, and even in the quiet of night. When they lay down at last, the aroma of labor followed them into dreams. Inside the town, silence did not mean emptiness. The quiet hum of insects rose steadily, searing from cracks in walls, from reeds by the riverbank, from unseen crevices where the small lives of the town made themselves known after human footsteps faded. The hush of the river could be heard more clearly at night, its waters brushing stones with a sound like whispered words, constant and patient, a reminder that while work ceased, the world never truly stilled. Somewhere, the distant toll of a church bell marked the hour with a low, resonant note that hung in the air long after the bell itself had quieted, and each strike seemed to sink into the marrow of the town, reminding all within earshot of the passage of time, of days folded into nights, of nights leading back into mornings again. Apprentices, weary from a day that demanded strength, patience, and attention, lay back on straw beds that rustled under their weight, the prickling touch of straw against fabric, softened by exhaustion. For them, the night was not simply rest, but a kind of closing ritual, exhaustion mingling with a calm sense of purpose, a quiet certainty that today had been endured and tomorrow would be endured as well. The rhythm of night was steady and predictable, yet within it lay many textures. Some apprentices lingered in whispers before sleep, trading short words, small jokes, or fragments of thought too light to share during the busyness of day. Their voices carried softly in the dim rooms, mingling with the sound of straw shifting, with the occasional cough, with the creak of timbers in the ceiling. Others slipped into silence quickly, closing their eyes almost before their bodies touched the bedding, surrendering to rest as if falling into water. Some lay awake longer, eyes open in darkness, gazing toward the faint glow of lantern light that leaked through cracks, thoughts wandering through memories, worries, and small hopes. Night gave space for reflection in ways day never did, and though apprentices spoke little of it, each one carried into sleep the quiet weight of questions: how long until they would finish their training? How long until they would stand as masters of their own craft? How long until they found their own place in the weave of village and town? From the streets, faint sounds drifted up, the clop of a horse's hooves on stone as a traveler passed through late, the shuffle of boots as a watchman paced his slow circuit, the squeak of cartwheels pushed by someone who had delayed their errands until even the stars were weary. The town at night was not entirely without life, but its life was subdued, softened, cloaked in a patience that daylight never allowed. Fires dimmed to embers behind shuttered windows, smoke curling faintly into the sky where stars hung low and bright, untroubled by the haze of day. The moonlight spread itself along rooftops, pale silver gliding over tiles and chimneys, making every edge appear sharper, every shadow deeper. Cats slinked along fences, their eyes flashing when they caught the lantern glow, their movements silent as though they too respected the stillness that reigned. Apprentices, lying in their shared quarters, listened to these night sounds without trying to. Their ears caught them as naturally as their lungs drew in air, and though fatigue pressed heavily upon them, part of their minds remained tethered to the world outside, attuned to its quiet. Sleep was not a sudden severing of connection, but a gradual loosening, like the slow untying of a rope, until the boat drifted gently out across still water. Dreams came softly, mingling with sounds from the town, so that the toll of a bell might echo inside a dream, or the creak of a beam might become part of imagined story. The apprentices did not know, nor did they need to know, where waking ended and dreaming began. It was enough to rest, to let body and spirit sink into the safety of night's embrace. Yet within this stillness, there was also a subtle strength. The town's quiet was not fragile but enduring, built from centuries of nights, just like this one. Every shutter closed, every lantern lit, every step of a watchman's boots formed part of a rhythm that repeated across years, across generations. Apprentices came and went, masters grew old and were replaced, children were born and grew into workers themselves, but the pattern of night remained. Lanterns still burned, rivers still hushed, bells still tolled, dogs still barked from far, corners, insects still hummed their unseen music. The apprentices, in lying down, joined this long continuity, their exhaustion not unique but shared by countless who had rested in this same town, in this same rhythm, across time. Nightfall did not belong to them, but they belonged to it, and in that belonging lay a form of peace deeper than comfort. Occasionally, storms disturbed the calm. Clouds gathered, winds rose, and rain fell in heavy sheets against shutters and roofs. Thunder rolled through the sky, rumbling against walls and echoing in courtyards. In those nights, apprentices pulled blankets tighter, listening to the wild voice of the world outside, grateful for the shelter of walls and the steadiness of their straw beds. The storm raged, but within, the same rituals held tools stored, fires damped, shutters closed, bodies at rest. Even in chaos, nightfall retained its essence, the town bending but not breaking, its people trusting that morning would come. Apprentices learned from this, too, that strength was not in resisting storms but in enduring them, in resting even when the world shook, in trusting the return of light after every darkness. Sometimes the apprentices dreamed vividly dreams of glowing forges, of rivers of molten iron, of sparks like stars scattering in night air. Other dreams carried them into the fields they rarely saw, wide stretches of wheat glowing gold in moonlight, or into markets full of voices that hummed like bees. Dreams were not lessons in the same way as the day's labors, but they still taught in their own way, weaving images of hope, fear, and longing into the apprentices' rest. They woke with fragments lingering, the feel of imagined heat on their skin, the echo of laughter from a festival, the image of a path leading somewhere unknown. These dreams shaped them quietly, as much a part of their growth as the calluses on their hands. Night after night, this pattern continued, unchanging, yet never quite the same. The apprentices grew used to it, came to rely upon it, finding comfort in the sameness of lantern light, of straw beds, of distant bells. The repetition became a rhythm, steady as a heartbeat, reminding them that life was not only about moments of change, but about the constancy that made change bearable. In learning to rest, in learning to trust nightfall, the apprentices were taught patience, humility, and endurance, the same lessons they carried into the forge each morning. And so, as they drifted into sleep, bodies weary but spirits calm, they became part of the great stillness of the town at night, a stillness that had held generations before them and would hold generations yet to come. Unbroken, unhurried, eternal in its quiet strength. As sleep approached, apprentices often drifted into dreams filled with sparks, fire, and the steady strike of hammers. Tomorrow would bring repetition, correction, and steady labor, yet also small triumphs, a smoother curve of iron, a sharper edge, a kinder word from the master. In these dreams, the forge became eternal, its fire a companion that never faded. Apprentices carried this rhythm within them, a heartbeat of iron and patience that shaped not only their craft but their quiet, enduring lives. The nights of an apprentice were unlike the nights of villagers who labored in fields or merchants who closed their stalls with heavy purses. For the blacksmith student, the body rested, but the mind remained tied to the day's rhythm. Straw bedding crackled faintly beneath their shifting weight, while the smell of soot lingered in their hair, and the ache of muscles reminded them of hammers lifted and bellows drawn. Yet the dreams that came were not burdensome. They were continuations, visions where work transformed into symbols and rhythms larger than life. Some apprentices dreamed of great doors forged with their hands, hinges so mighty they could hold the gates of castles. Others dreamed of swords glowing with impossible brilliance, weapons fit for heroes of old tales. The forge became a theater of the imagination, where what could not yet be done in daylight was accomplished in sleep. Night was also a time when the silence of the town made the forge's memory louder. Though the fire had been damped down and the hammers rested, apprentices felt the echo of its music inside them. The steady beat of iron against anvil turned into a heartbeat, a rhythm both calming and relentless. In their sleep, they were not simply boys or girls learning a trade. They were guardians of flame, keepers of ancient knowledge passed from hand to hand, strike to strike. This sense of belonging, of being part of something older and larger than themselves, gave them comfort. Even when the days were long and correction from the master felt sharp, the dreams restored their courage. Sometimes those dreams carried shadows too. Apprentices might see the fire flare too hot, swallowing metal until it crumbled, or hear their master's voice thunder with disappointment. The fear of failure slipped easily into dream, as it did into waking hours. Yet even those visions carried lessons, shaping the apprentice's resolve. They woke with renewed determination, vowing to listen more carefully, to strike more steadily, to attend with sharper focus to every detail of their craft. In this way, even sleep became part of their education. Another forge where character was shaped alongside skill. The cycle of dream and day blurred. One boy might recall a dream of shaping a horseshoe perfectly, only to find his hands steadier the next morning. A girl might dream of sparks falling around her like stars, and when she faced the fire again, she found herself less afraid of the sudden flare. Dreams gave courage by turning daily labor into poetry. They whispered that the effort had meaning beyond the sweat and soot, that within the endless tasks lay quiet victories that could not always be measured by the eye, but were felt in the heart. And so, apprentices carried the forge within them, at all hours. By day, its fire warmed their skin and demanded their labor. By night, it lit the landscapes of their imagination. They understood, even in youth, that the forge was not simply a place, but a rhythm of life. To be an apprentice was to surrender to repetition, to embrace patience, to know that tomorrow would look very much like today. And that was not a burden, but a blessing. Each sunrise was a chance to try again, to do a little better, to learn something new, however small. Over time, dreams of tomorrow's work became dreams of tomorrow's self. Apprentices imagined not only the tasks but the future they pointed toward. Some saw themselves as masters one day, standing where their teacher now stood, guiding new hands and voices. Others dreamed of wandering, of taking their craft to distant towns, of forging for strangers whose names they did not yet know. The anvil in their dreams was both anchor and gateway, tying them to the present but hinting at endless horizons. These nightly visions were shaped by the cadence of village life. The tolling of the distant church bell folded into their sleep, mingling with dream strikes of the hammer. The murmur of the river outside became the hiss of water-quenching iron. The creak of shutters in the wind became the groan of bellows. In this way, the whole world seemed to echo the forge, as though the blacksmith's trade was not only central to their lives, but woven into the fabric of existence itself. There was a tenderness in this continuity. Apprentices came to see that work and rest were not opposites, but partners. The labor of the day gave depth to the rest of night, while the dreams of the night gave courage for the work of the day. A smoother curve, a sharper edge, a kinder word. These were not just tasks to accomplish, but milestones of growth. Dream and daylight together taught them that mastery was not a single triumph, but 1,000 small triumphs accumulated over years. As apprentices aged, their dreams changed to the youngest, dreamed of fire as something magical, untamed, and vast. The older ones dreamed of technique, angles, temperatures, the timing of the hammer's fall. Near the end of their apprenticeship, dreams often took on a weight of responsibility, images of customers waiting, of families depending on their work, of apprentices of their own who would one day look up to them. The forge matured within them, its eternal fire becoming not just a companion but a destiny. And when they lay awake in the stillness before dawn, before roosters crowed and bells tolled, apprentices sometimes realized that the line between dream and reality was thinner than they thought. Tomorrow's work was already beginning inside them, shaped by memory, hope, and imagination. The fire might be out, the anvil silent, yet within their hearts the forge was alive, never ending, never fading. It was this realization that carried them forward, that to be an apprentice was not simply to learn a craft, but to become part of a rhythm as steady and enduring as the heartbeat of iron itself. The story of the apprentices at the forge, traced across days, seasons, and years, finds its quiet ending not in triumph or spectacle, but in the gentle weaving together of countless small labors, gestures, and rhythms that at first seemed insignificant, yet in truth became the very fabric of their lives. From the earliest mornings, when they swept the ash and laid kindling, to the evenings when the last embers were carefully damped and the workshop returned to silence, their journey was measured, not by sudden leaps but by the slow weight of repetition, by the patience required to tend both flame and spirit. To recall the whole apprenticeship is to recall a world shaped as much by endurance as by iron, the endless carrying of water, the gathering of fuel in all seasons, the weight of sweat beneath summer's heat, and the comfort of fire in winter's chill, the steady rise and fall of hammers whose rhythm became a second heartbeat. These apprentices lived within cycles larger than themselves, the cycle of day and night, of hunger and rest, of youth slowly maturing into competence, and, by submitting to those cycles, they learned the most enduring lesson of craft, that human beings, like iron, are shaped best not in haste but under steady, repeated strokes. To stand in memory with them is to smell again the mingling of soot and stew, to hear the creak of buckets at the well, to see the faint light of lanterns along streets at night, to feel the calluses grow on hands that once trembled when holding a hammer for the first time. Each detail mattered, not because it was grand, but because it rooted them in the living world. Apprenticeship was never only about forging tools and hinges, it was about forging character. The sweeping of the floor taught them respect for order. The sorting of scrap taught them the difference between what could be renewed and what must be discarded. The silent watching of the master's movements taught them humility and attentiveness, and the tentative striking of their own hammers taught them both the exhilaration of creation and the inevitability of failure. And in the evenings, when they rested on straw beds and drifted into dreams where sparks still leaped and hammers still rang, they carried within themselves a rhythm that would outlast even their years at the forge, a rhythm of patience, endurance, and quiet pride. The beauty of such a life lies in its ordinariness. No single day stood apart as decisive, yet all together formed a path as steady as the river flowing past the town. In the mornings, they awakened the workshop. By noon, they joined the household for simple meals. In the afternoons, they bent their backs to labor beneath the unyielding summer sun or found solace in the forge's warmth during the bitter cold. By night, they tidied their space and then allowed silence to take hold. And beyond the workshop, the apprentices learned the unspoken laws of community, how to greet neighbors, how to listen more than speak, how to carry themselves as both servants of craft and participants in village life. These lessons extended beyond skill, for they touched the roots of belonging. To be an apprentice was to understand that work is never isolated. The nails shaped at the anvil fastened doors for families. The hinges secured barns against storms. The tools enabled farmers to till soil and reap harvests. The forge stood at the heart of the community, and in serving it, apprentices came to know their own place in a wider pattern. Yet within this steady pattern, dreams persisted. As night fell and lanterns flickered, apprentices dreamed of tomorrow's work, not with dread but with expectation. Each day promised not transformation, but the possibility of one stroke falling truer than the last, one edge sharper, one curve smoother. Such small triumphs, when accumulated over weeks and years, became mastery. Mastery itself, however, was never final. Even the master blacksmith who guided them still learned from the iron, still listened to the fire's shifting breath, still discovered subtleties hidden in the music of hammer on anvil. In this way, apprentices understood that the forge was eternal, outlasting any single worker, carrying forward the voices and labors of generations past into the lives of those yet to come. To join this tradition was both humbling and ennobling. They were not merely learning a craft but stepping into a lineage where each blow of the hammer echoed with history. Looking back across their path, one sees how deeply their identity was shaped, not by moments of glory, but by the countless hours of unseen diligence. What is apprenticeship if not a meditation upon time itself? Each motion repeated, each tool touched, each spark watched with quiet wonder. Together these formed a kind of liturgy, a daily prayer expressed not in words but in labor. And from this liturgy emerged virtues that no book could teach. Patience came not from lectures, but from the endless striking and correcting, from mistakes endured and slowly amended. Endurance was learned in the sweat of summer days, when the forge seemed to burn hotter than the sun itself. And gratitude was born in the simple comfort of bread, shared at noon, or the kindness of a fellow apprentice offering a word of encouragement. Respect grew in the act of watching the master, in recognizing that true skill was quiet, unboastful, revealed only in the unbroken rhythm of labor and the calm that settled when a piece of work was rightly finished. In the end, the apprentices' lives remind us that mastery, in any form, whether of craft, art, or living itself, emerges not from haste but from slowness, not from impatience but from surrender to the long rhythms of time. The forge was their world, yet within its walls they encountered the full span of human experience, toil and rest, solitude and fellowship, failure and triumph, silence and music. And when they finally left behind the life of apprentices and stepped into adulthood, some becoming smiths themselves, others carrying the discipline into different paths, they carried with them not just technical skill, but a way of seeing, a way of being in the world. They had learned to honor fire, not as a master to be feared, but as a companion to be tended. They had learned to honor iron, not as stubborn resistance, but as potential waiting to be shaped. And above all, they had learned to honor the ordinary, to recognize that life's meaning is often hidden in the repetitive, the humble, the quiet. Thus the story closes not with a single ending, but with an ongoing rhythm, as enduring as the coals banked carefully each evening to be rekindled at dawn. The apprentice's journey teaches that every spark, however brief, joins a constellation of memory and skill, and every strike of the hammer carries forward the wisdom of those who struck before. Their lives remind us that the truest strength is forged slowly, the deepest lessons are learned in silence, and the most enduring fires are those tended with patience. And so, even when the workshop falls quiet, when the anvils cool and the tools are set aside, the rhythm continues within them, an eternal heartbeat of iron and fire, of labor and belonging, of dreams shaped not in haste but in the steady patience of a life lived close to the forge.